At first glance, Anastasia Everdene's life was going great. She was pretty, engaged, and lived in a beautiful mansion. But alas, this was not the case, and on another sunny day, the groom scolded her like a little child. Anastasia stood motionless and looked at him, and he told her that he was tired of turning a blind eye to her antics. The groom continued to say that he did not lose hope that the girl would realize her mistakes and correct her behavior. But she didn't listen to him. She just wanted him to just look at her. After all, the groom did not notice Anastasia and turned a blind eye to the fact that the servants always treated her with disdain. No one respected her in this house. No one listened to her, and they didn't even cook food for her, but served her scraps that were left over from the table. Anastasia always hoped that her fiancé would change his attitude towards her and love her, but this did not happen. So all she could do was stand motionless in his office, listen to his complaints, and wait for him to at least look at her. But he seemed to be mocking her, looked at the papers, and sharply raising his voice, said that he was tired of her willful antics. Finally, he raised his head and reminded the girl that she would remain his bride and he would not marry her. Anastasia looked away and held back her emotions, afraid that she might cry. She bit her lip, exhaled, and with a confident look, looked again at her fiancé. He was upset because he hoped that his words and actions would bring the girl to tears. Anastasia could not resist and reminded the man that the emperor himself insisted on their wedding. The door swung open and a servant rushed into the office with some important news. The man reported that a tragedy had occurred and His Excellency the Emperor had died. Anastasia did not expect such news and realized that she had now lost her patron. The girl's fiancé grinned and told her that her last support had finally sunk into oblivion. Time passed, winter ended, and spring came. But this time of year was the least favorite for Anastasia. It reminded the girl of her past and of the parents she had lost. Her father, Jacqueline Everdeen, was an ordinary man without any outstanding abilities. Having lost the struggle for power and being no longer of marriageable age, he took as his wife the daughter of a provincial baron, Verita Everdeen. Although the couple succeeded in obtaining the viscountcy, the estates at their disposal remained modest, and they were accompanied by poverty. Feeling inferior to his brother's success, Jacqueline hanged himself when his daughter was 14 years old. Not one of the relatives who came to his funeral shed a tear, but Verita Everdeen cried without stopping. Because she loved her husband, Anastasia stood silently throughout the funeral, keeping herself in check, but her mother's crying attracted her attention. Pulling her by the hem and calling her, the women hugged each other, and then our heroine began to cry. At the funeral, relatives whispered that it was Anastasia who discovered her father's body, and they felt sorry for the girl. But no one offered to help, and soon it became known that their family had a large debt. Unable to bear all this, Verita hurried after her husband and committed suicide. Anastasia also discovered her mother's body and was shocked by all of this. The girl's life was divided into before and after, because her friendly, beautiful, though not very rich family disappeared. And Anastasia was left an orphan, not understanding what to do next and how to live. Because of the law prohibiting the nobility from working, her days were accompanied by excruciating hunger. She lived in an empty, abandoned house without heating and was simply freezing from the cold. The girl didn't know where to get food because she had eaten all the supplies she had. Anastasia also ran out of water, and she understood that she needed to get it, but she was too exhausted to do so. The girl was very lonely, and she did not understand what she had done to deserve all this. Because she didn't get enough vitamins, the skin on her hands and feet became cracked. Thinking that she didn't want to live anymore, Anastasia closed her eyes and fell asleep. She dreamed of her parents, but this dream was a nightmare because she saw their hanged bodies again. And after them, in her sleep, she hanged herself, not wanting to endure hunger any longer. When she woke up, she screamed in horror, remembering how her parents died. But at the same time, the girl did not want to die just like them. She realized that she wanted to live. There was a noise outside the window. Anastasia opened the door and saw a very beautiful carriage. It had swans on it, which meant that the carriage belonged to the Everdeen family. The carriage stopped in front of the house where the girl was, and its door slowly opened. Anastasia saw that a woman who was dressed elegantly began to get out of the carriage. The girl immediately recognized her relative because she was the wife of Count Everdeen. The woman turned to Anastasia and told her that she was surprised that she was recognized. The countess began to examine the girl very carefully and evaluate her appearance. The relative noted that Anastasia looked quite good and was very similar to her mother. Having felt the girl's breasts, The woman noted the thinness of her body, but said that this could be very easily corrected. Anastasia did not expect such impudence from the countess, so she squealed and jumped back. The girl, with a sharp movement, pushed the relative's hands away from herself and was indignant at such behavior. Anastasia shrank back from embarrassment and covered herself with her hands. She felt uncomfortable being examined like some kind of merchandise. But the countess was no less indignant. She did not like the girl's behavior and called her impudent. The woman asked Anastasia in a menacing, commanding tone to watch her manners. The girl raised her head and looked at her relative in great surprise, not understanding why they were talking to her like that. The countess's lips slowly began to stretch into a smile, and she changed her menacing look to a sweet one. Laughing, she decided to tell Anastasia why she had come here after all. The whole point was that she was going to marry off our main character. Anastasia had nothing left to lose, because her life was already terrible, so she got into the carriage and left with the countess. The girl noted that the seats were very soft, and she had never sat on such ones. Even when her parents were alive, they couldn't afford something like this, and saved on everything. Arriving at the palace, the woman said that they needed to hurry, because their father was already waiting for them. At the palace, they were met by a man who looked beautiful despite his age, and was so similar to the girl's father. The duke smiled and asked the girl if she knew what political factions their empire was divided into. But seeing that Anastasia was in no hurry to answer, he began to tell her that the first faction was the imperialists, and that it included royal persons. The second faction is the aristocrats, and these are cultural figures and simply rich people. The third faction is the Catholics, and it includes people who belong to the church. Well, the last faction is the princes. It includes very influential people of their city. The man went on to say that Catholicism had declined 200 years ago due to corruption and was now dominated by only 3 factions. The Everdeen family has held imperialist views for generations. Aristocrats are not decisive, and if necessary, you can do whatever you want with them. But the whole problem was with the princes. The imperialists had no leverage against them, since they also came from the imperial court. Recently, Prince Redford passed away, thereby passing on his powers to his son, and he can now claim his right to the throne. This boy is incredibly greedy, unlike his father, and he wants to unite with other factions and take the throne. If he does this, they will be in big trouble, so the man needs to be shown his place. The Duke looked at the girl and reminded her that her family owed him a debt that he would take on, but in return, she would marry. The girl understood that they wanted to use her as a barrier between the prince and the throne. But even with all the abundance that will await her there, she doubts that she will be happy. But what does it matter? Because she already lives in poverty and suffers from hunger. Therefore, the girl agreed. Although she understood that the young prince would immediately reveal the intentions of the imperialists and hate her. Several months passed, and our main character was brought to the Redford mansion. She walked through the beautiful garden, was amazed by its beauty, not believing that she would now live here. A male voice called out to Anastasia, and the girl froze in fear, realizing that it was her fiancé. Plucking up her courage, she turned and looked at him, because they had never met before. The man's name was Theodore. He was young, handsome, and well-built. Anastasia noted to herself that she would not mind being his bride, and later his wife, because she really liked him. They looked at each other with interest, and that is how the girl's new life as the prince's bride began. After the announcement that the man was engaged, he continued to engage in social activities, and no matter how much Anastasia didn't like it, she had to accompany him everywhere. Once again, they came to a social event where there were many different nobility. Everyone began to look at the girl appraisingly and noted that, although she had a beautiful face, everyone knew that she was an orphan. The couple began to dance. Theodore looked at Anastasia and told her that the engagement would not wash her away from her poverty. After this, the man said that what he liked about her was that she could not fall any lower, because there was nowhere lower to go. Anastasia was shocked by this statement, but did not show it, and replied that she understood all this perfectly well. The girl looked at her fiancé and smiled at him, because she had to pretend that everything was fine with them. But he clearly didn't like it, because he was hoping for a different reaction from her. Continuing the dance, Anastasia decided to ask Theodore why he hated her so much. After these words, he turned the girl around and pressed her sharply to himself, saying that it could not be otherwise. Squeezing her tighter and harder, and hurting her, he said that although he had failed to avoid their engagement, she could not hope for anything. After all, the day will not come when she will become his wife and bear the name of the Redfords. Anastasia finished the dance, bowed, and was about to leave the hall. But then, turning around, she said with a grin that Theodore had probably forgotten, but it was not up to him to decide whether she would be his wife or not. Several days passed after the ball, and a letter with the imperial seal arrived at the prince's address. Theodore read the letter, and it demanded that Anastasia be placed in the princely residence. The man became angry, because he understood that the emperor wanted to register their relationship officially. Theodore threw the letter aside, sat down on the chair, and did not know what to do next. A few days later, Anastasia, having collected all her things, arrived at the Redfords' house. Her fiancé stood in his office and looked out the window, watching the girl cross the threshold of his house. The whole situation disgusted him, and he thought that it couldn't get any worse. Walking through the garden, Anastasia was mentally prepared for the fact that it would not be easy for her in the mansion, but Theodore did not pay much attention to her. Then, a servant called out to the girl and said that the prince did not allow her to go outside. Our heroine was shocked by such a statement and was temporarily speechless, but then she asked what she should do then, and the servant replied that the master wanted her to always be in her room. Anastasia grinned, and realizing that her fiancé was making fun of her, decided to act to the detriment of her. After all, since the girl moved in with him, he hadn't even bothered to see her even once. Our heroine, without thinking twice, went out into the street again, sat down where Theodore could pass and see her, and began to wait. But the man, not expecting such impudence, called the servant and ordered him to make sure that she never caught his eye again. The servants whispered behind Anastasia's back that she was a hated bride for her master and that she was doomed to loneliness. Because of the groom's behavior, the servants not only discussed the girl, but also simply hated her. Anastasia didn't pay any attention to all this because she was used to ridicule. The girl was never afraid of people's condemning and contemptuous looks. After all this was nonsense compared to what she went through after the death of her parents, and compared to the fact that she wanted to commit suicide just like them, because the past did not let her go. Here, of course, she is lonely, but she is warm, and at least she is not tormented by the feeling of hunger, and our heroine could easily endure everything else and live on. The girl suddenly felt sorry for Mr. Theodore, and she understood that he, too, was very lonely. So, without thinking twice, she decided to cheer him up and went outside again. Seeing the man in the window, the girl smiled at him and waved her hand, attracting his attention. Anastasia greeted Theodore and asked how he was feeling. But the prince did not answer the girl, and looking at her with contempt, he walked away from the horse. Our heroine didn't understand whether the man really couldn't stand her so much that he even drew the curtains just so he wouldn't have to see her. Theodore stood with his back to the window and realized that every time he saw the girl, she disgusted him. And what irritated him most were her bright green eyes, which he couldn't look into. After all, looking at them, Theodore remembered the one he hated, Duke Everdeen. The prince moved away from the window completely, saying that Anastasia seemed to him to be a very disgusting woman. So 2 years passed, and then the girl unexpectedly received a letter with an invitation to tea from the daughter of Marquis Sorokin. The letter stated that Anastasia must wear a blue dress. The girl could not refuse, and began to think where she could find money to buy a suitable outfit. After all, there will be a lot of influential people at the meeting, and if something goes wrong, they will avoid it. Anastasia remembered that she had one dress that she could wear, but it needed ironing. Its design may have been a bit more sophisticated, but it was blue and made of quality material. The girl took out the dress and realized that it needed to be slightly modified to make it look better. Our heroine noticed a maid in her bedroom, and, turning to her, asked her to call a tailor. In the end, Anastasia got the money to repair the dress, and it turned out simply magnificent. But on the eve of tea, the servants, who had stopped hiding their hatred for her over the last 2 years, did something terrible. The girl couldn't even imagine that they would act so cruelly and ruin her dress. And they won't just ruin it, they'll tear it to shreds so that it will be impossible to repair. Anastasia understood that she would not be able to reuse the fabric. The hem was also torn and dirty, and the girl realized with horror that she no longer had anything blue. Our heroine looked at the dress and didn't know what to do next or what to wear to the tea party. Suddenly, a loud laugh was heard behind her, and she turned around to see who had entered her room. It was the maids who laughed hysterically and with sarcasm in their voices, asking what had happened to the dress. Anastasia stood motionless for a while and tried to control her emotions. But then, gathering her strength, she looked at the servants with contempt. The girls felt uneasy and fell silent, and our heroine, saying that they would pay for her dress, turned away from them. The maids laughed again and told her that if she didn't hurry, she would be late for the appointment. Anastasia got ready and came to the tea party, but she still couldn't comply with the dress code. Here she heard the voice of Lady Sorokina, who greeted our heroine. All the invited guests were shocked by the girl's outfit and perceived it as impudence. The Marquise said with a grin that she was once again convinced that Anastasia had unyielding tastes. Everyone was waiting for excuses from our heroine, because each of them followed the dress code. And Anastasia began to make excuses, saying that due to unforeseen circumstances, she put on a different dress. To which Lady Sorokina responded sarcastically that it was probably just that the dress the girl came in suited her better. Our heroine felt uneasy about everything that was happening, but she didn't say anything else. Anastasia felt like a baked good on the table, as she was being eaten in the same way, with caustic remarks and contemptuous looks. The girl pretended not to notice the whispers behind her back, but every now and then they tried to prick her, asking uncomfortable questions. When evening came, our heroine got into the carriage and went home. She looked out the window and felt sad, realizing that no one would love her and she was doomed to loneliness. Anastasia again had thoughts of suicide, but she immediately drove them away because, despite everything, she wanted to live. The girl drove up to the Redfords' house and was grateful that she was warm and not hungry. Getting out of the carriage, our heroine inhaled the warm air and, hoping that tomorrow she would be forgotten, walked towards home. Entering the huge hall, she was already about to go to her room to take a shower and wash away today. But then someone's laughter caught her attention, so Anastasia stopped. The girl decided to see who was not sleeping at such a late hour and followed the voice. Our heroine saw the door ajar in the kitchen and realized that the cooks were talking. Anastasia froze because she heard them discussing her and saying that if she were not an aristocrat, they would buy a night with her. The girl was shocked by such words, and then one of the men chuckled, saying that it would be a waste of money. But the second one objected to him, saying that our heroine had too pretty a face. The men continued their argument, arguing that if her face was covered, there would be nothing to look at. Anastasia was outraged by this, but instead of telling the men what she thought of them, she began to back away. The girl was very upset and quickly headed to her room. Our heroine calmed herself down, thinking that it was all a trifle and she could handle it all. Running into the room, she closed the door with force and pressed her back against it. The cook's words echoed in her head, and unable to bear it, the girl sat down on the floor, covering her face with her hands. She convinced herself that she had no reason to cry, because she was well-fed, clothed, and had a roof over her head. But thoughts of suicide did not leave her, although she was afraid of ending her life the same way as her parents. Anastasia couldn't let the servants see her weak, so she gathered all her strength and stood up and headed towards the bed. After all, if Theodore sees the girl in such a state, he will gladly cancel the engagement with her. But the girl couldn't allow this, so she simply walked to the bed and, without even taking off her dress, lay down in it. Covering her head with a blanket, Anastasia nevertheless began to cry quietly. Out of despair, she again remembered the death of her parents. She became scared, and the girl realized that a sleepless night awaited her. In the morning, our heroine woke up, changed her clothes, washed herself, and was served her breakfast. But it looked like scraps, it smelled terrible, and it looked exactly the same. Anastasia did not understand what this was, and looked at the maid in bewilderment. But she stood there with a casual face, and pretended not to understand why our heroine was looking at her like that. Unable to bear the tension, the girl asked with a grin what Anastasia was not happy with. But our heroine was surprised by the servant's audacity, and asked if they really expected her to eat it. Anastasia looked at the maid in amazement, and waited for her answer. After a long silence, the girl finally answered that our heroine was a spendthrift if she wanted to throw out this food. Anastasia's world was divided into before and after. She couldn't believe that this was happening to her. Looking down, the girl decided to take another look at the food that was brought to her. There was a moldy, smelly soup in the plate, and the same bread lay next to it. Anastasia has long since gotten used to the fact that here they don't treat her like a bride. But the girl sincerely did not understand how she deserved such treatment, and why everyone hated her so much. That Theodore avoided her, and when he encountered her, he always looked at her with contempt. That the servants who were always whispering behind her back and making fun of her. And what about the cooks who allowed themselves to judge her and make vulgar jokes about her? Life at the Redford estate was becoming more and more unbearable every day, and it could not go on like this any longer. Anastasia felt offended, because she was not here of her own free will, but she gathered her strength, exhaled, and pulled herself together. The girl looked at the maid and told her that since everyone didn't like her so much, it was time to live up to it. At these words, our heroine picked up a plate of rotten soup. The food they gave her flew at the maid with all its force, splashing her from head to toe. Not expecting such behavior from her hostess, the girl indignantly shouted at her, not understanding why she did it. But Anastasia responded threateningly that if everyone wanted to hate her so much, then now at least there would be something to hate her for. The maid looked at our heroine in amazement and wondered what had come over her. After all, until yesterday the girl was so harmless, quiet, and silent. Anastasia looked at the servant and said that she was asking her nicely for now, and all she asks is to bring her some normal edible dish. The maid didn't understand why Anastasia suddenly decided to kick up a fuss, since no one here would stand up for her. And with a grin, she answered our heroine that she should open her eyes, because this was the residence of Prince Redford, and she had no rights here. Therefore, no one will follow the girl's instructions, and let her say thank you for bringing her at least something. Then the maid, casting a contemptuous glance, continued, saying that it was Anastasia who threw the plate. And as soon as this becomes known, the prince will be very unhappy with such behavior of his bride. At these words, Anastasia stood up from her seat and took a few steps towards the girl. The maid, not knowing what to expect, simply stood there, not moving. And it was in vain because our heroine slapped the impudent servant with all her might. The maid was shocked by her mistress's behavior and stood motionless for several minutes after the blow. Anastasia looked at her and said in a calm voice that she had not asked for much, and it was enough for her to just be full, and that was all. The maid screamed in pain and did not understand why she had been slapped. The girl felt blood running down her cheek and realized that the blow had cracked the skin on her face. The maid's eyes filled with tears from the hurt and pain she felt. Having come to her senses, the maid shouted at our heroine that if the prince found out about this, he would not leave it so easily. After all, Theodore values his staff, but he despises his bride, so he will leave her without food at all. Anastasia looked at the maid without a drop of pity and understood that the girl would not stop being rude to her so easily. So our heroine swung again and hit the maid with renewed force. At this time, a girl passing by decided to see what was happening in Anastasia's room and was shocked by what she saw. She was worried about her colleague and was afraid that our heroine would beat her to death. Therefore, without thinking twice, she decided to tell the owner about it. And she ran to his office at full speed, because every minute counted. Meanwhile, Anastasia beat the maid and took out all her anger on her for her rude attitude towards her. Our heroine looked at the servants with disgust, because they did not demand anything special from her, and the girl was always mocked. But now she's lying on the floor of her bedroom, covered in blood, looking pathetic. The maid sat down on her knees and, stuttering, began to ask Anastasia for forgiveness. Her face was covered in bruises, deep cuts, and blood was flowing from there, soaking her apron. The main character said with a grin that with such a face, a girl would no longer be taken as a servant to the nobility. And the maid begged again. She asked for forgiveness and promised to behave differently now. But Anastasia was adamant. She looked at the maid and did not want to let her go so easily. Our heroine said that all this happened because her words spoken before were completely ignored. But the maid immediately replied that she had realized all her mistakes and that no one would see such behavior from her again. Anastasia ordered the girl to get out of the room and leave her alone. She looked at the maid again and said that until this day, she had tolerated rude behavior, but now everything would be different. The girl left the room, and Anastasia got a headache from all this. She walked up to the balcony and decided to go out onto it to get some fresh air. Our heroine decided that now she would not worry and feel guilty about the fact that she was forcibly made a bride. And it is no longer enough for her to have just food and a roof over her head. She will demand respect in this house. Taking a deep breath, the girl smiled and felt herself getting better. Then one of the servants entered the room and called our heroine, saying that the prince wanted to see her. Having changed her clothes and tidied herself up, the girl approached Theodore's office. She came in, and it was funny to her that just recently her fiancé had asked her not to catch his eye, but now he had called her himself. Anastasia entered the office and saw the prince and a girl from the servants, whose face was covered. Theodore was very angry, and seeing our heroine, he asked why she allowed herself to behave like that. The girl smiled and replied that her fiancé was asking her some strange questions. Anastasia also looked at the prince with admiration and noted to herself that she was losing her mind next to him. But Theodore clearly didn't like the girl's reaction, and he looked at her very carefully. The man said that he did not see the slightest remorse in the eyes of our heroine. And after such behavior, she does not dare to call herself a human being. Anastasia was shocked by this statement at first, but then she exhaled and smiled. The girl took a step towards her fiancé and said that this situation could be looked at in different ways, and that she considers herself a human being, because only he is capable of such actions. Theodore did not understand her joking mood, and sternly said that the maid she had beaten had been working there for a very long time. Therefore, Anastasia will not get away with such behavior, and she must know her place in this house. Our heroine came even closer to the groom and asked him if he thought it was the servant who didn't know her place. Anastasia continued to be amused by the situation and said that if his standards for servants were that low, then she had bad news. After all, the servants are the face of the house, and in this case, it speaks to the fact that the Redford family itself is in decline. Theodore did not expect such impudence and such behavior from his bride, and he became even more angry. The man reminded Anastasia that she herself was born into a nondescript family and now has the audacity to insult his family. At the mention of her parents, the girl's expression changed and her smile disappeared somewhere. After that, having pulled herself together, she asked in a serious tone what was so remarkable about Theodore's family. Anastasia moved away from her fiancé because she was afraid of crying and could no longer look him in the eyes. Our heroine began to examine the candlestick, and this helped her hold back her tears. And then the girl said with a grin that a man who humiliates his bride cannot be called the head of the family. Theodore clenched his fists in anger and could no longer control himself and calmly react to the girl. The man hissed through his teeth at Anastasia to watch her words, calling her a shameless woman. Theodore's face changed. His eyes were filled with rage, and our heroine realized that she had found his weak spot. The girl couldn't stop being sarcastic, and so without thinking twice, she told her fiancé that he was nobody without his name. Theodore clenched his fists so hard that the veins on his hands stood out, and from this gesture, it was clear that he was incredibly angry. Through gritted teeth, the man told the girl to thank fate that her parents had fun. Otherwise, after everything the girl told him today, he would have killed them himself. Seeing how Anastasia's face changed and realizing that he had touched her, Theodore smiled. Here our heroine clenched her fists and gradually became enraged by these words, and her fiancé continued to say that it was painful for him to realize that he could not kill her parents with his own hands. Anastasia was simply speechless. She didn't expect Theodore to be so pathetic as to touch her where it hurts. Suddenly, the girl remembered the picture of how she discovered the dead bodies of her parents. The girl was offended by her father and mother, who died, abandoning her, and considered all this irresponsible. But that didn't mean she didn't have good memories with her parents. Anastasia remembered her childhood and how she was always happy when her dad came home from work. As a girl, she always ran up the stairs to meet her father, and he obediently stood and waited for her downstairs. Mom was always worried about her daughter and said that running up and down the stairs was very dangerous. But Anastasia didn't listen, so she knocked her father down and hugged him as tightly as only a little girl can. Our heroine always waited for her father to come home and looked at him with adoration, and he loved his daughter immensely and always hurried home to his family. At these moments, they were very happy, and no one expected that, in the end, grief would happen and Anastasia would be left an orphan. Our heroine returned to the present and thought that no matter how much Theodore hated her, there were things that could not be said. The girl got angry at her fiancé and remembered that she had promised herself not to tolerate rude treatment in this house any longer. Anastasia swung and slapped the prince, putting all her resentment towards him into this blow. The man's cheek turned red, and he was in a lot of pain. He didn't expect such a reaction from the girl. Our heroine felt a little better, but she was still angry at Theodore. So she swung at him again, but she had already started beating him in the chest, screaming that she hated him. The prince became frightened and realized that he had gone too far with his statements and had greatly offended the girl. Grabbing Anastasia's hand, Theodore stopped her next blow to his chest, and our heroine, with tears in her eyes, told him that it was not she who was inhuman, but he. And tearing her hand away, she pushed the man away from her, because she was disgusted even to stand next to him. Anastasia quickly turned around and left the office, and the prince stood motionless. Our heroine ran to her room and was very angry at her fiancé, arguing that his behavior was low. After all, Theodore is simply taking advantage of her helplessness to vent all his anger, and he wouldn't allow himself to do that with others. Several days passed since then, and our heroine's life became easier. She was finally fed normally. People around her began to treat Anastasia with caution because they were afraid of her. And then one day, when the girl was getting dressed, she noticed a new piece of furniture in her room. The maid brought it there, so our heroine, without thinking twice, took the candlestick and hit her hard. At that moment, someone called out to her and asked why she did it. Anastasia was not happy with the guest, because it was Theodore, and lately he had been coming into her room too often. The man repeated the question and said that in his opinion, his fiancé's aggressive behavior this time was unjustified. But our heroine decided to explain what had upset her and pointed her finger towards the small table. Anastasia said that it was this maid who brought the flower that stood on it into her room. Theodore, looking at the flower, said that he did not see anything wrong with it, because the maid only wanted to decorate her room. But our heroine explained that this flower symbolizes an executed woman who is beautiful but cruel. Anastasia understood that with such a gesture, the arrogant servant wanted to insult her. Therefore, our heroine, without hesitation, decided to punish the maid accordingly. Anastasia understood that no matter how much pain she and Theodore caused each other, nothing would change. After all, even though they are standing on the same stage, they are standing with their backs to each other, and time is flowing past them senselessly. Time passed, but nothing much changed in the life of our heroine, except that she constantly changed maids. And then, one day, when the new maid was combing her hair, she accidentally pulled it with the comb. Anastasia cast a menacing glance in the direction of the servants and abruptly stood up from her seat. The maid covered her face with her hands and began to apologize, and our heroine began to scream that she would not forgive her hair being pulled out. And when Anastasia beats up the maid once again, Theodore arrives and, as soon as he enters, immediately begins to be sarcastic. The prince grinned and asked if his bride could at least spend a day quietly, and with these words, the girl let go of the servant's hair. Our heroine reported that they tried to pull out her hair, and she, as the owner, had to teach them a lesson. Theodore didn't like that Anastasia called herself the mistress, so he called her an arrogant bitch, but she thought he would say that, so she just smirked back. Theodore and Anastasia had arguments over every possible reason, and when they met, they never took their eyes off each other. On the girl's part, this signified complete distrust of her fiancé, because she always expected meanness from him, and they both understood that staring at each other was not a sign of love or anything like that. Time passed, and our heroine did not notice how she had already met her 20th winter. Anastasia spent time at home, and very often went to receptions to which they were invited. Once again, the girl sat at the table, sorted through the invitations, and was surprised that there were so many of them. She didn't want to go anywhere, but since she was the prince's bride, she had to visit all of this. Our heroine felt like a rag doll that had no voice of its own and was being controlled by someone. Anastasia threw one invitation after another on the floor and understood that she was being invited to events only because of her status. But no one truly loved her, and no one sincerely expects her, just as she hates those who surround her. And so the prince and the girl accepted another invitation to a dinner party. Everyone around was dancing, having fun, and were in couples. But our heroine stood alone. She felt a little sad about it, but she knew she wouldn't worry about it. Anastasia heard other girls talking about her behind her back and laughing at the fact that she was all alone. The next two ladies were quite loudly discussing that, despite our heroine's pretty face, her fiancé didn't care about her. Anastasia caught disapproving glances at herself and understood that no one was happy to see her there. Pulling herself together, our heroine looked at the gossips, and they laughed. After this, having reported that Anastasia had no upbringing, the girls stepped aside. Our heroine was tired of standing on the sidelines, but she didn't know what else to do or how to behave. When she saw Theodore, she hoped that he would have the decency to ask her to dance, since she was only here because of him. But her fiancé was not looking at her. He was talking to some men and laughing loudly. Theodore deliberately ignored Anastasia because it was a punishment for her behavior, which she allowed herself to do with the servants. Our heroine understood this, but decided not to show him her emotions. She consoled herself with the fact that her leg hurt anyway, and she didn't really want to dance with him. Here, an unfamiliar man noticed her, and, taking a few steps forward, told his friend that he wanted to meet her. Anastasia didn't expect this, so she cast a fearful glance at the man. But then a friend stopped the stranger, telling him to forget about it. Otherwise, he would get into trouble later. And he continued to say that if his friend was so hungry for lonely women, then he could just go to a recently opened pub. Our heroine opened her mouth in amazement, and she felt very disgusted that she was compared to some kind of sellout. Anastasia couldn't listen to all this anymore, so she decided to leave the room. She walked quickly towards the exit to the terrace, and behind her, she heard everyone discussing her escape. Stepping out onto the balcony, our heroine stopped for a second and realized that she no longer heard the music or voices behind her. Anastasia exhaled sharply and understood that here she was, albeit temporarily, safe. Finally, the girl was left alone, and no one looked at her with disdainful eyes. Our heroine approached the balcony railing, and the moon illuminated her beautiful appearance. Anastasia felt alone in this world and extremely lonely, realizing that she was about to cry. But then our heroine heard the balcony door open, and turning around, she saw a male silhouette appear in it. He was a very handsome and stately man, and he was clearly not indifferent to the girl's condition. The stranger asked if everything was okay with the girl, but she was stunned and did not say a word. The man thought he had scared our heroine and immediately made it clear that he was not there to mock or hurt her. Anastasia noted to herself that she had never seen this man before, and he surprisingly inspired confidence in her. The girl understood that the stranger did not look like those who remained in the hall, but nevertheless, she decided to clarify who he was. But our heroine suddenly lost her voice and began to cough from excitement. And having regained her voice, she continued, saying that although he seemed harmless to her, she could not trust a stranger. They stood silently for a while, looking at each other, not knowing what to say. And finally, the stranger pulled himself together and introduced himself, saying that his name was Sergei. Anastasia looked at the man with surprise, because she noticed that he was very worried. Sergei's face suddenly turned red, and out of embarrassment, he looked away. The girl smiled coquettishly at the strange man, and realized that she had never seen anyone blush so much. Our heroine suddenly realized that no one had ever spoken to her before, and that some kind of miracle was happening to her now. Moreover, she had never seen a more handsome and interesting man. Therefore, Anastasia, beaming with happiness, decided not to miss this opportunity and joked that one name was not enough for her. After a while, they were already sitting on the balcony railing, and the girl was amused by the fact that Sergei was embarrassed and blushing. The man was very well-mannered, so he tried to hold back his smile and asked our heroine not to laugh at him. But Anastasia only looked at him with a grin, at his rosy cheeks, and said that she had no intention of laughing. The girl turned on all her natural charm and looked at Sergei, but instead of becoming embarrassed and blushing again, the man lowered his eyes to the floor and became very serious. Sergei asked our heroine if it was true that she couldn't lie. Anastasia was very surprised by this question, and she asked what made him think that she might be lying to him. The man looked at her slyly and replied that she simply looked away too often. The girl peered into Sergei's face and did not understand whether he was joking or speaking seriously, but just in case she decided to object to him. Our heroine looked even more closely at the man and said that she doesn't look away. She just gets distracted sometimes. And Sergei grinned again and noted that the girl's voice was also shaking badly. Anastasia thought that the man was behaving very calmly and was noticing various pleasant little things in her behavior. All this could mean only one thing. She was interesting to Sergei, and she wanted this moment to last forever. The girl looked again at her new acquaintance and did not believe that the gods had become favorable to her. After all, this is the first time in a long time that she is talking to an interesting person. Sergei looked attentively at our heroine, and his lips involuntarily spread into a smile. Anastasia felt a strange feeling and did not understand what it was and why it was happening to her. But looking at the man, she understood everything. It was because he did not hate her and treated her like a girl. Waltz music began to come from the closed doors, because the dancing was not over yet. Sergei stood up from the railing and headed towards the hall, and the girl thought that she would like to stay with him a little longer. The man said that he felt like the last tune was playing now, and the dancing was about to end. Our heroine looked at the closed balcony, and remembering that she hadn't danced today, answered with sadness in her voice that Sergei was right. The man carefully approached the girl and casually touched her. But Anastasia didn't react to this in any way. She sat motionless and lowered her gaze to the floor. Without thinking twice, Sergei extended his hand to the girl and invited her to dance. Our heroine, who had already despaired of seeing the man again, looked at him with surprise. Sergei waited for an answer, but Anastasia froze in amazement, not believing her happiness. The girl thought to herself that this evening was the best thing that had happened to her lately. So without a shadow of hesitation, she offered her hand to the man and trusted him completely. Looking at Sergei with amazement and warmth, our heroine's heart began to beat faster. Getting up from the railing, she asked again the name of her new friend, because she had missed it. He replied that he would repeat his name without any problem, but asked her to remember this time that his name was Sergei Milbach. And smiling, they opened the balcony door together and, holding hands, walked out into the hall. Anastasia was very afraid to go out to people, because she understood that everyone would only look at them. But for some reason, the girl decided to trust her partner, and taking a step forward, walked out into the hall. Our heroine was excited and very happy about her new acquaintance. Anastasia and Sergei passed by the nobility, heard whispers behind their backs, but did not pay attention to them. Theodore noticed his bride and froze. He couldn't even imagine that this would happen. The prince understood that all attention was focused only on this couple, and now this would be discussed at every ball. But the girl didn't care what her fiancé thought. She was happy at that moment. All our heroine's attention was riveted on her new acquaintance. Sergei also did not take his eyes off his companion, and his lips spread into a smile. Having bowed to each other, our newly formed couple began to dance. The girl, without a shadow of a doubt, offered her hand to Sergei and trusted him completely. Our heroine had not been so happy for a long time. She was pleased that the man looked at her without a shadow of contempt. Anastasia's lips involuntarily spread into a smile, and she wanted this moment to last forever. Sergei pressed her to himself. The girl gasped. Their hearts began to beat at a furious speed, and they did not understand what was happening to them. The girl moved away from her partner a little, and smiling, told him that now she would never forget his name. The man looked at our heroine with trepidation, and really hoped that they would definitely meet again. After this, Sergei, a little embarrassed, told Anastasia that she had an incredibly beautiful smile. The girl, not used to receiving compliments, was stunned for a while by these words. But then our heroine, feeling some warmth and tenderness in her soul, broke into a smile again. Our couple danced, not noticing anyone around them. It seemed to them that they were alone in this hall. But this was not so. Everyone was watching them closely, and especially Theodore. The man was very unhappy with this turn of events, and therefore became angry. The prince did not like the happy expression on the girl's face, and hearing the whispers in the hall, he felt stupid. Suddenly, Anastasia stumbled and accidentally stepped on Sergei's foot. The girl was embarrassed and afraid that her companion would get angry, so she immediately asked for forgiveness. But Sergei just smiled at her, saying that he hadn't noticed anything, and continued dancing. Our heroine was surprised by such a gentlemanly act, because no one had ever spoken to her so kindly before. The man looked at her very carefully and told her that he had not danced with such a flexible girl for a long time. And then he added that even if Anastasia stepped on his foot, he wouldn't feel it. The girl looked at Sergei with admiration. She liked the way he treated her, and her heart began to beat wildly again. The man suddenly became very serious, and his cheeks became flushed again. Our heroine realized that Sergei was now experiencing the same feelings as she was, and looking at her partner with trepidation in her soul, the girl was glad that this inspiring feeling had finally opened up to her. This feeling was called falling in love, and they were both experiencing it now. Several weeks had passed since the meeting with Sergei, and Anastasia and Theodore continued to go to dinner parties. Previously, the girl hated them, but with the appearance of Sergei, such events began to sparkle with new helmets. Our heroine always looked forward to these meetings, because now her life had acquired some meaning. Sergei was also always glad to see Anastasia, because all his thoughts were only about her. At the next ball, the girl, seeing a man, ran to him, leaving her fiancé alone. Theodore didn't like all this, but he couldn't influence our heroine in any way. All the prince could do was stand aside and watch as his bride left the hall with another. Theodore merely became a shadow of Anastasia, who attracted all the attention of the nobility. People whispered behind his back, saying that Prince Redford, despite all his influence, was unable to control his bride. Theodore was very angry about all this, and he clenched his fist so hard that the veins on his hand stood out. And the girls behind his back continued to say that they were not surprised by the behavior of his fiancé, because he treated her very badly. The prince, once influential and respected in society, suddenly became the object of ridicule, and he clearly did not like this. Anastasia went out onto the terrace with Sergei, and as she closed the door behind her, she heard everyone around her discussing her fiancé. She turned to her companion and told him that at last everyone in the hall was laughing not at her, but at Theodore. Sergei looked at her carefully and realized that the girl was very amused by this fact. Our heroine knew that the man would not laugh at the prince because he was his master. Therefore, not seeing support, Anastasia turned away from Sergei, but he did not lose his head and hugged her from behind. The girl enjoyed the moment and realized that she would never have him completely because he would not go against Theodore. But Sergei, looking at our heroine, seemed to read her thoughts and therefore told her that he was ready to do anything for her. Anastasia looked at him in surprise, and he continued to say that his heart belonged entirely to her. So if he needs to fight for her, he will do it with pleasure. But now he is glad that she is just nearby. The girl looked at Sergei and realized that love really is so sweet that you want to squeeze it tighter and not let go. After the ball, our heroine returned to the castle and could not sleep, walking back and forth around the room. Anastasia wondered if it would be strange if she invited Sergei on a date herself. After all, the girl could no longer wait for the next ball, and was afraid that Theodore would not accept the invitation in order to avoid ridicule. Suddenly, the door to our heroine's room opened, and a servant entered. Anastasia was surprised by such a late visit, but the maid, afraid of her mistress's anger, said that she had simply brought a letter. Approaching the letter and taking it in her hands, our heroine was overcome with anxiety and fear. After all, it bore her family's coat of arms, and the girl realized that the letter was from Duke Everdeen. Our heroine opened the letter with trembling hands and began to read it quickly. The letter stated that recently rumors had begun to circulate about her in society, and the Duke did not understand what Anastasia was thinking. He demanded that she immediately appear at his mansion, and the girl, angry, thought that until now the Duke had not cared about her. But our heroine could not disobey the order, so a few hours later she arrived at the Duke's house. Anastasia, getting out of the carriage, heading to the castle, understood that they would most likely talk about Sergei. The girl looked out the windows of the house and realized that she had not been here for several years. But the house didn't seem like home to her. It was cold, and our heroine didn't like being in it. Hearing a painfully familiar voice, Anastasia looked away and was very surprised. The girl was told that the Duke was already waiting for her, and our heroine grinned. After all, it was the maid who said all this, whom Anastasia beat and kicked out, and now they met here. The servant asked the girl to follow her and led her into the Duke's office. After this, the maid, without looking our heroine in the eye, very quickly left. Anastasia bowed to her uncle and said that she was very glad to see him. The Duke sat at the table, smoking as usual, and said with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time. The girl was shocked by his audacity, because they had attended the same dinner parties so many times. But everywhere the Duke hid his relationship with her and did not pay attention to her, and now he dares to tell her that they have not seen each other for a long time. The uncle began to examine our heroine very carefully and told her that she had noticeably changed and was no longer timid. Anastasia answered him with a very serious look that if he were interested in her life, he would understand why this happened. The girl felt the Duke's contemptuous gaze on her and sensed that he was looking at her as an object, not as a person. The uncle continued speaking, asking what our heroine was so unhappy about. But Anastasia answered in a calm tone that she was already happy with everything in her life. The Duke said that her behavior indicated the opposite, because she was acting very ugly towards the prince. The uncle said that he understood that Theodore had a bad character and that the girl was not happy about it, but that was no reason to behave like that. Anastasia became very angry and told the Duke through gritted teeth that she had not planned to offend the prince. After these words, Uncle could not stand it and said that he knew perfectly well about her meetings with another man. He started shouting that he didn't understand what the girl would do if Theodore demanded that the engagement be broken because of this. The Duke slammed his hand on the table and said that he did not understand why our heroine was acting so rashly. Anastasia stood up and said with a serious face that she did not understand what was wrong with her behavior. The girl continued to say that no one understands her and does not see her as a person. Everyone around looks at her with contempt. All these years, she felt like no one needed her, an abandoned rag doll being controlled. They mocked her, treated her rudely, and she, having no right to vote, endured it all. But after Sergei appeared, she realized that she finally felt like a human being. He is the only one who looks at her with love, and she will not let anyone take that away from her. The Duke clearly did not like her speech, and nervously he grabbed a new cigarette from the table and lit it again. Our heroine, plucking up her courage, said that she felt like she had done nothing wrong. But her uncle clearly did not expect such insolence, and looking at her very angrily, asked her to repeat what she had said. But Anastasia was not afraid, and turning to the Duke, she began to taunt him that if he asked her to break up with Sergei, she would not do it. The uncle was very angry, his expression changed, and he slammed his fist on the table. But the girl didn't even move from her place. She simply repeated in a calm tone that she did not intend to part with her lover. Theodore doesn't deserve her, and she won't sacrifice her relationship for him. Our heroine looked at the Duke and repeated even louder that she would never abandon Sergei. The uncle was furious. He was not used to such an attitude towards himself, so he shouted that Anastasia seemed to have forgotten who she was talking to. But the girl also shouted back to the Duke that she didn't care who was in front of her. She would do as she saw fit. Covering her face with her hands, she said that Theodore didn't even see her as a person, and she didn't understand why she had to put up with all this. Our heroine has become happy for the first time in a long time, and she is not going to give up all this. The uncle slammed his fist on the table. The dishes flew everywhere, and he ordered the girl to shut up and immediately end her affair. Anastasia shouted that the Duke did not dare to call her mutual, loving relationship by such a nasty word. After all, Sergei truly loves her, and she doesn't understand why Uncle, who should want the best, forbids her to be happy. The Duke could not listen to all this any longer. His eyes were filled with rage. He reached out to the ashtray that remained lying on the table and picked it up. He swung and threw it at the girl, hitting her in the face, as she didn't have time to dodge. Our heroine started bleeding, because a deep wound appeared on her cheek. The ashtray fell with a crash behind Anastasia, but the girl herself stood motionless. Uncle said through clenched teeth that he would do everything possible to make Sergei disappear from her life, since she did not want to resolve everything in a good way. Our heroine's heart sank at these words, and she replied that if something happened to Sergei, the Duke would pay dearly for it. Uncle shouted that Anastasia couldn't do anything, and that she would have to part with her lover anyway. The girl clenched her fists in anger. She understood that the Duke was very influential, and he was threatening her. But our heroine was not one to be scared, and she began to shout that she would never do what was required of her. She wants to live like a human being and feel loved, and with Sergei, she is truly happy. The Duke was speechless. He did not expect Anastasia to disobey him. And the girl, realizing that they would not be able to come to an agreement, turned around abruptly and left Uncle's house. Sitting in her carriage, she wiped away the blood oozing from the wound and considered her next steps. But our heroine was sure of only one thing. She would never part with Sergei. The carriage pulled up to the Redfords' house, and Anastasia wanted to contact her lover as quickly as possible. And then, going outside, the girl saw the one she wanted to meet the most. She didn't understand what he was doing here, but she was very glad to see Sergei. Our heroine was afraid that perhaps the Duke had already reached him, and so she immediately said that she did not intend to part with him. Sergei became serious. He clearly did not expect such words from Anastasia, and did not understand what was happening. But after that, he smiled and said that he was in the same mood, and they would always be together. The couple began to meet more and more often. They walked, laughed, and were happy. And Theodore watched all these meetings from his office. Every time the prince saw how happy Anastasia was next to Sergei, one thought popped up in his head again and again. He believed that someone with the surname Everdeen simply had no right to smile like that. Theodore felt sick looking at her, but at the same time, he could not take his eyes off her noble hair. The girl laughed and was very happy lately, especially next to Sergei. The prince noted that every day the ringing laughter of our heroine could be heard within the walls of the mansion. And in the 4 years that she has been here, she has never laughed so much or been so happy. Theodore did everything to make Anastasia's stay in his house terrible. But with the appearance of Sergei Milbach, the son of the baron and vassal of the Redford house, everything changed. The girl and the man spent time together in the garden all the time, laughing, and their eyes glowed with happiness. But Theodore couldn't watch all this calmly, so he closed the curtains. The prince sat down on the pedestal and could not help but think about what was happening in the garden. The man tried to switch his thoughts, but he was very bad at it. At that moment, Anastasia laughed again very loudly, and Theodore heard this laughter. He cursed under his breath, closed his eyes, and could no longer stop thinking about the girl. The prince understood that if the girl had not been Everdeen, he would not have been so heartless towards her. After all, how can one not be filled with compassion for the unfortunate woman who became an instrument for achieving the Duke's goals? And so Theodore understood perfectly well that if this girl had not been sent to him by her uncle, then everything would have been different. They really could have become a couple, and the prince would not have felt such hatred towards her and would have fallen in love. But alas, the girl's last name is Everdeen, and therefore he cannot stop hating her. The feud with her uncle began long before Theodore and our heroine were born. But the prince still remembers Duke Everdeen's snake eyes, and every time he sees them, it turns him inside out. Theodore understood that the girl's entire family was a family of imperial dogs who carried out his will on their behalf. After all, how many times have people received letters that ruined their lives? And all of them had the Everdeen family crest on them. Duke Everdeen personally poisoned and killed Master Theodore for no apparent reason. And after that, he came to the prince's father and pretended that nothing special had happened. He looked at them very carefully, and from his smile, it was clear that nothing good was to be expected from him. The emperor simply wanted Theodore's teacher dead, but the criminal was never found. There is no doubt that his father's death was also his doing, and therefore the prince will never forgive the Everdeens. After all, they took away his beloved teacher from him, and they also took away his father. And Anastasia, alas, is one of the members of this family that he hates, even though she was still a child then, like him, and knew nothing of her uncle's deeds. That didn't matter, because when Theodore looks at her, he sees her beautiful green eyes, and they remind him of the Duke, whom he hates, and whose appearance makes him sick. And he sees the Emperor himself, who, although not with his own hands, destroyed so many lives. And the prince understood that this was enough for him to hate the girl. Here, before the man's eyes, a beautiful image of a girl once again appeared. He closed his eyes, but the image did not disappear, and Theodore became fixated on Anastasia's simple smile. And remembering her, the prince's heart involuntarily began to beat faster, and he felt warmth towards the girl. But the man considered this feeling to be simple discomfort, because he did not want to think about the reason for the changes happening to him. The girl's ringing laughter was heard again in the yard, and he noted to himself that she had no right to happiness. Eventually, Theodore decided to eliminate the source of his discomfort. A reception was held at the Imperial Palace, which was the last one this year. Theodore and Anastasia could not miss it, although they began to attend such events less often. The couple walked down the stairs and all eyes were on them. After they stopped, the girl immediately pulled her hand out of Theodore's. Anastasia began to look for her lover with her eyes in order to immediately approach him. The prince was very irritated by this, and he began to get angry because she was indifferent to him. And so our heroine finally found the image of Sergei Milbach in the crowd. Theodore was very angry because he had hoped that the man would not come to the ball. And the girl, seeing her beloved, was very happy and immediately went to him. Anastasia didn't even look at the prince and didn't ask permission to leave him. This made him even more angry, and he realized that he could no longer tolerate this kind of treatment. He grabbed our heroine's hand abruptly, and she screamed, not expecting it. The girl started screaming that it hurt, and Theodore loosened his grip a little, but didn't let go. The prince, leading Anastasia behind him, went with her to the terrace, as he needed a quiet place for conversation. They went out together, but the prince did not let our heroine go, fearing that she would run away to Sergei. The girl looked at Theodore and asked very indignantly what he was doing. The prince realized that Anastasia was very angry, but did not understand what shocked her so much. After all, even his cold attitude towards her at the residence had never angered her so much. Was she really that nervous because he had interrupted her meeting with Sergei? But Theodore decided to tell her everything here and now. Our heroine asked the prince to let go of her hand because his grip was very painful for her. But the man stood motionless, so Anastasia began to shout at him and hit him in the chest. Theodore began to say in a calm voice that perhaps it was time for the girl to remember her situation. He won't let himself be dragged through the mud, and our heroine must live in such a way that others won't notice her. Until now, the prince had already told Anastasia many times what he should not have said, and this time was no exception. Theodore said that he was disgusted to watch the girl flirting with men like some kind of waitress. The man looked at our heroine and hoped to see pain on her face, and for a split second, her lips trembled, and she suddenly became very serious. But the prince did not take one thing into account. The girl had a hard life, which made her immune to such trifles, and Anastasia was so dear to Sergei that she didn't care what her fiancé said. The girl looked closely at Theodore, smirked, and said that he was pathetic. Our heroine continued her speech and said that she was disgusted to look at the prince. At these words, the man squeezed Anastasia's wrist even tighter, causing her unbearable pain. He looked at her and couldn't believe that the girl was not only not offended by his actions, but on the contrary, it all amused her. And our heroine continued to say that the fall of his reputation would be a real pleasure for her. After all, she gets pleasure from seeing him lose the only thing he has, his name. And why on earth should she live watching the expression on his face? After all, he didn't care about her condition and feelings. And now they had simply changed places. At these words, the girl raised their clasped hands up and with a sharp movement pulled hers out. They looked at each other, and both had strong hatred in their eyes. Anastasia grinned again and informed Theodore that all the obstacles he was creating were not scary to her. After all, it is they who further strengthen the love for Sergei in her heart. Looking at the prince, she said that what he was demanding of her would never happen. Theodore's face changed, and he replied that everything would be as he wanted, so she would have to leave Sergei. The prince clenched his fists in anger, and he did not like the fact that the girl was not going to follow his orders. Our heroine looked at her fiancé with great surprise and did not understand whether he seriously believed that she would do what he wanted. Anastasia decided to remind Theodore that in life, very often, everything does not go according to his plan. And she said that she even became his bride, although he did not want this at all, and would bear his name, despite his words. But the prince, hearing this, became very angry and said that he would not allow this to happen. But our heroine replied that this is exactly how it would be, because thanks to this, she would remain with her beloved forever. Maybe not as his wife, but it's enough for her just to see him every day at the Radford Castle. Here Anastasia saw Sergei behind Theodore, who was looking for her, and after this, the girl informed the prince that they had finished their conversation and she needed to go. Without even looking in the direction of her fiancé, she ran out of the terrace and ran up to her lover. Theodore was in despair, and turning around, he looked at the girl walking away from him. He noted to himself that our heroine had really changed in 4 years, and now she was happy. But the prince could not believe that they had changed places, and now he had become a laughingstock in the eyes of others. Theodore looked at his hand, which had just been holding the girl's hand, and he clenched his fist in anger, realizing that he had lost his power over our heroine. The prince remained standing on the terrace, all alone, because he was ashamed to go out among people. A few days later, Anastasia and Sergei were sitting in the garden and having tea. The servants, who were walking nearby, discussed the couple, saying that they began to meet very often, and that the girl began to organize tea parties, to which she invites only Sergei. They didn't understand why our heroine was hiding behind a dinner party, because everyone understands that there are feelings between them. But then they approached the gazebo where Anastasia and Sergei were sitting, and suddenly fell silent, afraid that they would be heard. It was winter outside, but our couple didn't mind the cold, and the girl, stroking the man on the cheek, said that she missed him very much. Sergei looked at her in surprise and said that it was strange, because they had only broken up yesterday. But our heroine said that even if they see each other every day, it is not enough for her. The man laughed and replied that he, too, would like to see her more often. Anastasia decided to court her man and began to pour him tea. And then the girl remembered the last reception and the unpleasant conversation with Theodore. And she told Sergei that the prince spoke to her very harshly and called her a waitress. Her lover came closer to her, and our heroine looked at him very carefully. Sergei began to apologize to Anastasia, saying that he was to blame for all of this. But the girl stroked his cheek, telling him that he had nothing to apologize to her for. And then she continued her speech, saying that the only one she expected an apology from was Theodore. Our heroine told Sergei that what happened was not his fault, and that only the prince was to blame for everything. Anastasia knew that her lover would never say anything bad about Theodore, because he was under his command. Sergei was a hostage to circumstances, and it was easier for him to blame himself for everything. The girl took the man by the hand, stroked it, and said that she did not want to hear an apology from him. Our heroine intertwined her fingers with his and said that Sergei was sinless to her. Anastasia sat on her beloved's lap and felt sad that she couldn't help the man in any way. The girl cursed the day when she became the bride of the prince she hated so much. The man saw that our heroine was sad, and taking her hand, he squeezed it tighter. And then, with pain in his soul, he told Anastasia that he would very much like her to become his bride. The girl looked at him in surprise. She didn't believe what she had just heard. Our heroine said that she was pleased to hear all this, but she had doubts that Sergei was telling her the truth. The man was offended by these words, and, grabbing his sword, said that he was ready to swear to her on it that he was telling the truth. Anastasia did not expect this, and said that it was the first time she had seen a knight swear so frivolously on a sword. Sergei looked at the girl and said that his intention was quite serious and well thought out. Our heroine realized that the man was not joking about his intention to marry her and looked at him very carefully. Anastasia would have gladly accepted his offer, and she would not have cared about all these imperialists, Redfords, and others. She stopped Sergei from making vows, saying that she was happy simply because they could spend time together. Then, the girl heard a noise coming from the garden of the Redfords' house. She looked in surprise to see what was going on there, and was shocked by what she saw. A lot of men burst into the courtyard and headed towards them. One of them looked in their direction and said that they had come for Sergei. The whole point is that the prince organized an urgent meeting to which everyone must arrive. He shouted that they were all heading there and that Sergei needed to hurry too. The man's face changed. He became very serious, realizing that something bad had clearly happened. Sergei turned to Anastasia and, asking for forgiveness, said that he was forced to leave her for a short time. The girl looked at her lover with great fear, and her heart began to beat faster. But Sergei reassured our heroine, saying that she had nothing to worry about and that he would be back in a moment. Anastasia removed her hand from his sword, because she understood that a man could not disobey the prince's order. Sergei looked at the girl and told her not to be bored, because he would soon return to her. Despite the fact that her beloved asked her not to worry, our heroine felt anxious. Anastasia froze in anticipation, and her intuition told her that something very serious had happened. Theodore gathered all his subordinates, began his meeting, and he had bad news. With a serious look, the prince reported that the Romi had started a war with them. The Romi are a people who come from Roma, and they rebelled against their entire principality. Their cities were devastated for the wealth of the imperialists, and now they are thirsty for revenge. They are constantly in a state of war, despite constant losses. For this reason, the emperor transferred these troublesome lands to the possession of the princes. Prince Redford had fought them many times, and he had never had any trouble defeating their small army. Theodore said that he intended to send one person as usual, so that this person would return victorious. The prince looked carefully at his subordinates, and his gaze stopped on Sergei. He knew that Anastasia's beloved would be able to win. But while he was gone, he would at least stop hearing the girl's laughter. And even though this fight will only last a few months, at least he will be able to live in peace. Theodore knew that all this time the girl would be sad without her beloved. Therefore, without hesitation, I decided to send Sergei to this fight. The prince was happy that this decision came so easily to him, and he voiced it immediately. After a while, Sergei stood opposite the table in Theodore's office and waited for instructions. He bowed to the prince and said that he would be glad to bring him another victory. Theodore had a smirk on his face and was already anticipating the moment when Anastasia would find out about everything. Having given instructions to his subordinate, the prince could only wait for the long-awaited silence in his castle. And he could not be more pleased that everything had turned out so wonderfully in his favor. Sergei left the office and went to the gazebo, where the girl was waiting for him. He told her that he would have to go to war, and our heroine began to beg him to give it up. But the man said that he could not disobey the prince's order, so he had no choice. Anastasia, of course, expected that something would interfere with their relationship, but she just couldn't believe it. The girl's face was gone. She turned pale and realized that she could lose her beloved forever. She came closer to Sergei and asked how long he was leaving her for. Sergei smiled and said that he would try to return as soon as possible. Our heroine was outraged that they were being treated this way, and again began to beg for her lover to stay. But he repeated to the girl that this was His Highness's order, and he could not disobey it. Sergei took the girl's hand and pulled it towards him. He understood that she was very scared right now. He leaned over and kissed her hand, saying that he gave her his word that he would be back by spring. Anastasia looked at him and said that if he had even a little understanding of how dear he was to her, he would never have left her like this. The girl understood that she had no choice but to pray that he would return safe and sound. Our heroine, barely breathing, told Sergei that she would wait for his return, and the man, looking into her eyes, promised to definitely return to her as soon as possible. A few days later, her lover had to go to war. Anastasia did not come to say goodbye to him and watched him leave from her bedroom window. Sergei was serious as always and didn't even pay attention to the fact that the girl was watching him. But then he turned around abruptly and raised his head up, noticing our heroine in the window. His lips spread into a smile, and with that, he told her that everything would be fine. Anastasia spent every day waiting for her lover, and without leaving her room, the girl constantly sat by the window, and it seemed to her that any minute now she would see him. But contrary to all expectations, the war dragged on for a very long time, and winter was already coming to an end. Our heroine was beside herself. She remembered that he had promised her to return in the spring. She wrapped herself in a warm blanket and again felt very lonely. Sergei hardly responded to her letters, and she did not understand what she had done to deserve all this. Every day she waited for the war to end and was afraid that something had happened to her beloved. Then someone knocked on her room door, and Anastasia turned around, hoping that she had received another letter. But alas, it was the maid who merely brought her another meal. The table was laden with food. Everything looked very appetizing and smelled just as delicious. But the girl couldn't swallow the food. She felt sick just from the sight of this wonderful food. After all, she thought that Sergei was starving there and couldn't eat because of the current. Our heroine sat at the table with an empty plate and simply stared into space. Anastasia asked the maids to clear everything from the table, as the sight of the food made her sick. The servants did not understand what was happening to the girl and froze for a while, not knowing what to do. But our heroine got angry and shouted for the girls to carry out her order immediately. The servants whispered behind Anastasia's back, discussing that they did not understand what had come over the girl and that it seemed she had gone crazy. They looked at our heroine and spoke in whispers, afraid that she would hear them. But Anastasia sat silently and embroidered some picture, not paying attention to anyone. After all, ever since the girl's lover ended up at the front, she seemed to be paralyzed. Every night, our heroine had nightmares, and she very often woke up from her own screams. Anastasia barely touched the food during lunch and immediately turned inside out. And each time the embroidery became more and more terrible, turning into some kind of madness. The servants were outraged that Theodore simply turned a blind eye to the condition of his bride. And at first, it seemed that the prince's mood was always high. But the servants noticed that after the war began to drag on, he changed a lot. This war brought a lot of worries and troubles to everyone. Spring came, but no letters came from Sergei. And then someone knocked on the girl's room door. Anastasia really hoped that a new letter had arrived. But Theodore entered the room. The girl was very upset when she saw him, because she didn't want to meet him. The prince was very surprised to see how his bride had changed. She had lost a lot of weight and had dark circles under her eyes. Our heroine turned away and asked why Theodore had come into her room. And then the prince, plucking up his courage, said what Anastasia was most afraid to hear. He brought her news that it looked like Mr. Sergei had passed away. The man stood in Anastasia's room and watched her reaction very carefully. But then Theodore grabbed his head, because he himself could not believe that his warrior had died. Our heroine stood motionless and did not immediately understand what the prince was telling her. The girl, exhausted from waiting for her lover, asked the man to repeat what he had just said. Theodore looked at Anastasia very seriously and said that Sergei was no longer alive. Our heroine covered her ears with her hands and screamed that she didn't want to hear this lie. But the prince did not like her reaction at all, so he came even closer to her and extended his hand. The girl did not pay any attention to her fiancé and asked why he was talking such nonsense. Theodore grabbed his bride by the hand and said that she must listen to him. The prince removed Anastasia's hands from her ears and asked her to accept the truth about Sergei. Our heroine began to resist and scream for the man to shut up. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she began to realize that she would never see her beloved again. Anastasia tried to break free from her fiancé's grip, because now she wanted to be alone. But Theodore did not let go of the girl's hand and was shocked by her reaction. At some point, the prince got tired of our heroine resisting, and he shouted at her. The man looked at his bride very seriously and asked her to pull herself together. Anastasia froze, looked at her fiancé, and asked why he was pretending that nothing had happened. But Theodore decided that the girl needed to be calmed down, and so he asked her to catch her breath and come to her senses. After all, he understood that the girl's breathing was ragged due to strong excitement. Our heroine looked through the prince, and the image of her beloved appeared before her eyes. The girl could not believe that she would no longer see his beautiful appearance. From all these experiences, Anastasia felt very dizzy. Our heroine lost consciousness, but Theodore managed to catch his bride. In their state, there was another nation that belonged to the same ethnic group as Romi. That was Aaron. These two nations had never been on friendly terms, but in order to win, they joined forces. The Empire learned of this insidious alliance only after Sergei's death. His body was returned to his homeland without his head, and it was a miracle that he could be identified at all by his armor and scars. All this horrified Anastasia, because the lost head would never be found. because the people of Erin had a custom of taking the heads of corpses with them after a successful battle. Even after the man's death, the Empire still managed to win. But for our heroine it didn't matter, because her beloved could not be brought back. Those around her did not know about her relationship with Sergei, so she was forbidden to attend even the funeral. But the girl could not miss this event, so she stood near the church where the farewell was taking place. Anastasia thought all this was unfair, because she really wanted to say goodbye to Sergei. But all she could do was cry, doubled over in unbearable pain, to the sound of bells. Our heroine screamed that it would have been better if she had not known him at all, and had not remembered his beautiful appearance. But then she took her words back, because the time spent with Sergei was the best time in her life. The months passed one after another, and the girl stopped leaving her room. She withdrew into herself and spent all this time crying uncontrollably. Anastasia wrote letters to the Milbach family, asking to be allowed into their family crypt, but was refused each time. Our heroine did not understand why they were doing this to her, and everyone around her thought that she had lost her mind. The girl kept talking to herself and shouting that Sergei had not kept his promise. Anastasia was very upset that life was so unfair to her, because she had the right to happiness. The pain she felt was much greater than what she felt when she lost her parents. Our heroine scolded herself for not leaving anything that would preserve the scent of her beloved. Anastasia walked around the room and screamed, because she could not believe that Sergei left her alone in this world. Having fallen onto our bed, our heroine sobbed and understood that she would never be able to live the same way again. The girl wanted more than anything in the world to remember the image of her lover. But alas, she had nothing to confirm that the time spent with Sergei was real. The servants constantly whispered behind Anastasia's back, saying that she had completely gone crazy. Theodore, meanwhile, looked pleased and even a little refreshed. But in reality, he was also worried, because he did not want his warrior to die. Deep down in his soul, there was also a strong pain scratching at him because of everything that was happening. The prince did not expect either Sergei's death or that the news of his death would kill Anastasia. Theodore certainly wanted the girl's laughter to stop echoing in his house, but he didn't want to see her despair. Recently, our heroine began to appear frequently in his dreams, and for reasons unknown to him, in these dreams he hugged and comforted her, and the girl silently looked at him, with her eyes reddened from tears. Theodore did not understand why he had this strange and incomprehensible dream so often. Time passed, winter came again, and after a whole year of gradual weight loss, Anastasia was exhausted. Our heroine was absolutely not happy about anything, and she did not experience any emotions. But suddenly, one day, the girl discovered an interesting package in her room. Anastasia looked at her in surprise and asked the servant who she was from. And then the maid said something that our heroine never expected to hear. After all, the parcel was from her lover's father, namely from Baron Milbach. The girl, hearing a name familiar to her, froze, not understanding why the parcel was sent to her right now. Anastasia understood that this package was clearly somehow connected with her lover, so she began to open it very quickly. There was some kind of snow-white fabric in the box, and it was very strange. But when she took the fabric out of the box, our heroine realized that it was her beloved's shirt. The girl was happy with such a gift, because now her memories of Sergei will last for a long time. Anastasia hugged the shirt to herself and didn't immediately notice that a letter had fallen out of her pocket. Our heroine still heard the envelope land on the floor and looked in its direction in surprise. Picking up the letter from the floor and reading it quickly, she clearly realized who she should hate and blame for Sergei's death. Out of anger, the girl crumpled the message with a sharp movement and hid it. From that moment on, Anastasia clearly realized that Theodore was the only one to blame for the death of her lover. But our heroine did not understand why the prince treated her this way and what she did to deserve it. After all, she was in such severe pain that she prayed for death every night. The girl hugged Sergei's t-shirt, and suddenly she realized why Theodore was doing this to her. Her fiancé clearly wanted her to commit suicide, shattering her hopes for a happy future. Anastasia understood that the prince would not allow her to live like a human being and would always mock her. After all, the only one who could save her from the abyss of despair was Sergei, who is no longer alive. After all, it was then on the terrace, when she fell into a deep depression, that he was the only one who looked at her as a human being. At that time, our heroine could not even imagine that her life would change so much. But it was on that day that the girl felt alive, and she just wanted to live, love, and be loved. Anastasia replayed all her meetings with Sergei in her memories. Our heroine slowly wandered through the corridors of the castle, and did not even immediately understand where she had come. But then she heard the voice of the advisor, who said that his master was not receiving anyone at the moment, as he was very busy. The girl looked up and saw that she was standing outside Theodore's office. Anastasia told the man to step aside, because she needed to talk to the prince. But the advisor did not leave the door, and said that he was ready to convey all the information personally. Our heroine stood there for a while, peeing, and her face showed absolutely no emotion. The man, in a quiet and calm voice, told the girl to return to her room. But Anastasia didn't like all this, and she shouted for the advisor to step aside. After this, the girl used her strength and pushed the man away from the door. The advisor was shocked by our heroine's behavior, but did not have time to do anything. Anastasia opened the office door, entered it, and saw her fiancé sitting at the table. Our heroine slowly and on tiptoes approached Theodore, silently looking at him. The prince was surprised by the girl's appearance and did not understand why she was behaving so strangely. The girl looked down and said that she wanted to ask the man something. Theodore, still not understanding what was going on, told her that she could safely ask. Anastasia came even closer to the table and asked why he hated her so much. The prince broke out in a cold sweat, and for a moment his expression changed. The man sat silently, not knowing exactly how to answer this question. But our heroine clearly didn't like this silence, and so she asked if he really found her disgusting. Theodore began to grip the armrest of his chair in excitement, and replied that he really hated the girl. Anastasia did not expect that the prince would answer her so truthfully and without emotion, and asked why everything was like this. The man hesitated, and then said that all this was only because our heroine bears the name Everdeen. The girl said that if she weren't Everdeen, he would be kind to her. Theodore looked at Anastasia and seriously thought about her words. Our heroine also fell silent for a moment, because her thoughts were confused in her head. But then the girl realized that everything the prince told her were just empty excuses, and he actually doesn't hate her. But a man hates the fact that he is being controlled. After all, the Duke, together with the Emperor, without Theodore's consent, made her his bride. Anastasia's strength left her for a moment. She leaned on the table and laughed. Our heroine looked at the prince and said that she considered his anger to be fake, because he was just a coward. The man looked at the girl silently and did not understand how to react to her words. Theodore absolutely did not like the fact that Anastasia's face was completely devoid of emotion. Our heroine got tired of the prolonged silence, and she told the prince that he was a coward and a vile, disgusting murderer. The girl was 100% sure that he was to blame for Sergei's death. The man looked very carefully at Anastasia and only now noticed one important detail. After all, our heroine had Sergei's shirt in her hands, which the Duke had obviously sent her specifically on behalf of the Milbach family. Meanwhile, the girl became dejected and said that she had died along with her beloved. Anastasia buried her face in Sergei's shirt and said that thanks to Theodore, she learned that a person can die while still alive. Our heroine felt that everything that was happening to her was very unfair. After all, she sincerely did not understand why she alone had to go through all this. The girl believed that the prince should also share this fate with her. Anastasia was silent for a while and understood that she wanted to take revenge on her fiancé. Here, our heroine looked at the man with some strange and crazy look, and she said that Theodore would fall in love someday, and then she would kill this man. The girl will definitely get her way, poison his beloved, or push her off the roof. But the prince can have no doubt in her words, because she will kill his beloved at any cost. The girl slowly approached her fiancé and tenderly touched his hand, and she very sweetly whispered in the man's ear that he should fall in love with someone as soon as possible. Theodore felt the cold anticipation of revenge begin to choke his neck. Anastasia said that it is not for nothing that they say that love burns brighter when there are obstacles. Our heroine leaned towards the prince and whispered in his ear that this is exactly what happened with Sergei. After all, every time Theodore tried to forbid her from communicating with her beloved, or when her uncle scolded her and threatened to take away everything from her, even her name, and every time people gossiped and whispered behind the girl's back, her love for Sergei grew stronger and stronger each time, and Anastasia is sure that everything will be exactly the same with Theodore. After these thoughts, our heroine again ran her hand over the prince's hand and asked him to quickly fall in love with someone. After all, then he will become very happy, and Anastasia will happily stand between them. And at the moment when the man's love reaches its peak, our heroine will kill his beloved. Theodore lowered his eyes to the floor and tried his best not to look at the girl, but she did not back down from him and said that she would cause him the same pain that he had caused her. And for the sake of her revenge, Anastasia is ready to play absolutely any role. Everyone around will think that the bride killed her groom's mistress out of jealousy. After all, now she will show everyone how madly she loves Theodore. Our heroine said that with her revenge, she would evoke sympathy from those around her. So from now on, she will pretend every day that she loves her fiancé. Although in reality, the girl hates the prince so much that she simply cannot stand it. But only he will know about her hatred, because those around her will believe in her love. Anastasia quickly began to put what was said into practice and followed Theodore everywhere, on his heels. The prince was a little irritated by all this, but he didn't say anything and simply sometimes looked at her silently. Our heroine's face almost always did not express any bright emotions, but as soon as they met eyes, the girl broke into her sweet smile. Anastasia always looked at her fiancé very carefully, trying to guess what was going on in his soul. And every time he looked up, our heroine whispered words of love to Theodore. For the prince, this whole spectacle was incredibly strange and unusual. But from those around her, it seemed as if she really loved him. One evening, the servants were doing the laundry and were discussing how Anastasia seemed to have completely lost her mind. After all, our heroine behaved as if Sergei never existed. Although everyone around knew that the girl was madly in love with him, the maids knew that Sergei had a reputation as a scoundrel, although it seemed he really treated Anastasia differently. And in general, this relationship was beneficial to everyone, because while the knight was alive, the servants could breathe a sigh of relief, because our heroine was happy, passionate about her relationship, and stopped beating the maids. But now the girls were afraid of Anastasia again, and did not know what to expect from her. As soon as the servants heard someone's voices in the park, they continued washing in silence. Theodore was sitting in the living room at dinner at this time, tapping his fingers on the table. The man was nervous, because he had received a letter that Anastasia had read. It was written by an unknown person, but the prince assumed that it was either done by the duke or by the Romans themselves, whom he had paid. Theodore was very angry, because he had given a lot of money to hide the fact that he was the one responsible for Sergei's death. Although in exchange for silence, the prince left the Romantsev alone, hoping that they would be of some use. The man understood that all of them could be useful to him on the territory. After all, according to the laws of the empire, the second and third sons do not receive a share in the inheritance. Therefore, Theodore could hire them as soldiers and thus reduce the crime rate. And thus it is legal to attract money from the empire under the pretext of war. But Anastasia is absolutely useless, apart from her competence. And then the prince grabbed his head, trying to drive away all thoughts of the girl. After all, now he had to think about how to keep track of the public mood. At this point, the advisor entered the living room and said that Theodore needed to stop working during dinner. But the prince replied that he could not allow the emperor to do whatever he wanted, and therefore he decided how to control it. The advisor replied that he completely agreed with his master, but now he thought he needed to rest. Theodore chuckled and said that since the man insisted, then he would go to bed. But before leaving, the prince instructed the advisor to distribute all payments and food in accordance with the harvest. While the man was recovering from the shock of having been assigned so many tasks, Theodore calmly walked down the corridor towards his bedroom. The prince understood that he was truly tired, so he had enough for today. Then the door of his room opened, and out came the one he least wanted to see. It was Anastasia, and the man was very embarrassed at the sight of her. Our heroine was dressed in a transparent negligee, under which her underwear was visible. The girl came up to Theodore, stroked his cheek, and said that he did not look healthy. Then Anastasia giggled and said that she had been waiting for her fiancé for so long that she almost fell asleep. Theodore looked at her very carefully and asked what our heroine was doing in his room. The girl took him by the hand and said that she was his fiancé, so she had the right to wait for him there. After this, Anastasia pressed herself even closer to the prince and laughed very cheerfully. The man did not understand what was happening and why our heroine was behaving so strangely. Here the girl made an offended expression on her face and said that her fiancé seemed not to care. But Theodore didn't like all this at all, so he didn't express any emotions. After all, the prince understood perfectly well that all of Anastasia's actions were nothing more than pretense. Anastasia looked at the man and said that she wanted to spend much more time with him. All these words did not evoke any emotions in Theodore, and so he stood silently for some time. But the prince could not bear it any longer, and told her to stop this whole circus, because everything she was saying was a lie. Here the man looked very seriously and attentively at our heroine, and he noted to himself that, looking at her smile, He sometimes began to think that she really loved him. Here, Theodore froze, and realizing that all his thoughts were only about the girl, he became scared. The prince stopped and, thinking that he was simply tired, decided that he wanted to go to bed quickly. So he immediately pulled his hand out of Anastasia's embrace. After this, the man felt a little awkward, but he was glad that he did not give in to the girl's actions and pulled himself together. At this point, Theodore's face became very serious, and he looked very carefully at Anastasia. The prince said that if our heroine were an actress, then in terms of the quality of her acting, she would have no equal in the entire empire. The girl looked at her fiancé very attentively and with surprise, but realizing that the man was falling for all the tricks, her lips spread into a smile. Anastasia did not hesitate and went to Theodore, saying that all her feelings were real. Approaching the prince, our heroine hugged him around the neck and pulled him towards her. Whispering that she loved her fiancé very much, the girl reached out to him to kiss him. Theodore was shocked by his bride's behavior and froze for a moment, but having come to his senses, the prince pushed our heroine away, asking why she was doing all this. The girl swayed back and, moving away from her fiancé, repeated that she simply loved him and therefore wanted to kiss him. Theodore looked silently at Anastasia and again convinced himself that she was lying to him. After this, the prince went to his room, saying that he was very tired and wanted to be alone. Our heroine, realizing that all her tricks had not worked and the man was leaving, became upset. Theodore, meanwhile, went into his room and closed the door behind him, but the girl hurried after him. Anastasia began to knock on the door with all her might, begging not to leave her alone. The prince decided that he would not let our heroine into his room, but for some reason, this made him sad. Closing his eyes, the man told himself that he should not fall for the girl's tricks. After all, he remembered very well the scene in his office, where Anastasia promised that she would take revenge on him. Time passed quite quickly, and the cold golden autumn arrived again. As every year, our heroine, along with Theodore, received an invitation to a ball at the palace. The girl, having received it, was not at all happy about it, because she did not want to go there. Previously, she happily attended balls and danced at them with Sergei, but this time everything would be different. And Anastasia, angry at these thoughts, squeezed the invitation tightly. Our heroine was thirsty for revenge and knew that she would gladly make Theodore suffer. The girl was ready for anything, and therefore, at the ball, she needed to show everyone how much she loved her fiancé. She dreamed of the day when she would finally see the suffering on the prince's face. She wasn't even afraid that he might kill her in a fit of rage. After all, she understood that only by taking her revenge would the girl finally be able to meet Sergei again. After these thoughts, Anastasia came up and took her lover's shirt in her hands. Our heroine said that she missed Sergei very much, and after that she kissed the shirt. The girl looked up and saw a maid who entered her room. Anastasia asked if the servant had informed Theodore of her desire to have dinner with him. The maid did not expect this question, because the prince refused every time anyway, and therefore she stopped asking him about it. The servant looked down and said very guiltily that she had forgotten to convey our heroine's words to Theodore. Anastasia looked at her maid very attentively and seriously. Then, our heroine's lips spread into a grin, and she already knew that she would punish the servant. The girl, as always, resorted to force and beat the maid with a candlestick, who did not carry out her order. The maid left Anastasia's room and met an advisor named Evan in the corridor. The girl started screaming that she couldn't stand this kind of treatment any longer. Evan covered his eyes with his hand and said that our heroine's character was getting worse day by day. The maid said that she was afraid that if Theodore refused to give her dinner the next time, Anastasia would simply kill her. The maid started screaming that she was at her limit, and if nothing changed, she would follow Betty and Katie. She fears that the blows will leave her with a scar on her face, like Emily, who is now forced to work in the kitchen. The advisor felt sorry for the maid, and he understood that Anastasia had become too much of a problem. Because of our heroine, many servants had already left the mansion, and something had to be done about it. But more importantly, Theodore could not allow the family's authority to decline. Otherwise, they would not find new servants. Evan put his hand on the servant's shoulder and said that she herself knew how much the prince hated Anastasia. Therefore, she needs to be patient, because Theodore will certainly do something soon, and the advisor, in turn, will talk to him. Meanwhile, the prince sat in his office and worked very hard. After some time, the man leaned back in his chair and decided that he needed to take a rest. Theodore's eyelids began to feel heavy, and he realized that he might fall asleep now. But as soon as the prince fell asleep, For some reason, he dreamed of Anastasia again and again. In every dream of his, our heroine was very sweet and whispered words of love to him. Then Evan knocked on the office door and said he wanted to talk to the man. Theodore was very glad that his sleep was interrupted and asked the advisor to come in. Evan said that Anastasia wanted to have dinner with the prince again, and this time, having received a refusal from him, she beat the maid. Theodore didn't like that the advisor had come to talk to him about the one person he least wanted to think about right now. But Evan continued anyway, saying that everything our heroine does affects her fiancé's reputation. Therefore, the advisor believes that the prince needs to break off the engagement as soon as possible. Evan understood that being in alliance with the girl, Theodore was monitoring the movements of the imperialists and the emperor himself. But Anastasia's actions have already crossed all boundaries, and almost all of their servants have left the mansion. We could turn a blind eye to everything if our heroine behaved appropriately in society. But the advisor reminded the prince that the girl had met with Mr. Sergei in front of everyone, and now everyone in society makes fun of Theodore, and only bad rumors circulate about her. And that's not to mention that Anastasia uses violence against all the servants. Therefore, Evan, taking into account all of the above, believes that it is time to call off the engagement. The advisor understood perfectly well that the imperialists would not allow this so easily, but he could try. After all, in Evan's opinion, our heroine is poison for the Redford family. Theodore froze for a moment and simply did not know what to answer to all this. After all, he understood that the advisor was right in everything, but the prince felt somehow uneasy from these words. The man didn't like it when someone spoke badly about his bride. Although he himself hated her, Evan began to get annoyed by Theodore's prolonged silence, and he drew attention to himself. The prince raised his eyes, looked at his advisor, and said that it was not yet time to break off the engagement. Evan was shocked by his master's words and said that he did not agree with him, but Theodore clearly didn't like the counselor arguing with him, and so he shouted at him to shut up and listen to him. The prince said that he believed that the time had not yet come to break off the engagement. After all, the emperor's position is still stable, and Duke Everdeen is enjoying his power, because he always swore allegiance to his master and carried out his orders. Who else can compare with him now in terms of his influence in society? Evan looked at Theodore without emotion and didn't know what to say to all this. And the prince said that because of the Duke's influence, it was not yet time to break off the engagement with Anastasia. And if it were a matter of annulling a normal engagement, Theodore could have simply reported it and paid compensation. But now our heroine has been living with him in his mansion for several years, which equates their relationship to a de facto marriage. And therefore, he will not be able to prove in any way that he had nothing with this woman, and she remained innocent. So, it is not possible to break off an engagement, which is equivalent to marriage, unilaterally. Evan said that the prince was right, because the breaking of such relations takes place in the imperial palace. The advisor bowed to his master, and really hoped that Theodore had some idea on how to get rid of the girl. The prince, in turn, told Evan that for now, they had to tolerate our heroine in their house. The advisor's face showed no emotion, and he said that he would try to assign a new servant to the girl. Theodore was fed up with this whole conversation, so he told Evan to leave his office. The advisor bowed again and asked forgiveness for disturbing his master. The man headed towards the exit of the office, but then the prince stopped him. Theodore said that he had one more very important request that needed to be fulfilled. Evan turned to the prince and said that he would do whatever he wanted. Theodore asked to tell Anastasia to get ready for dinner with him. The advisor clearly did not expect such a turn of events, and therefore froze in the passage for a while. He couldn't believe that his master, after all that had been said, decided to have dinner with our heroine. Evan understood that he could not disobey the prince's order, so he told the girl about it. Anastasia, who was still beating her maid, was glad that Theodore had finally agreed to have dinner with her, so she immediately let go of the maid's hair and said that she needed to get ready. Leaving the girl unconscious and throwing away her candlestick, our heroine headed to her dressing table. Taking the comb from him, Anastasia began to slowly tidy herself up. 2 maids came into our heroine's room to help her get ready, and the girl told them that all she had to do was bark at the servants, and Mr. Theodore agreed to have dinner with her. Anastasia believed that all this time, the servants did not convey to the prince her desire to have dinner with him. Our heroine understood that the maids considered her a fool, and understood only the language of violence. Looking at the servants, the girl said that they were no better than animals. After this, Anastasia, pleased that she had achieved her goal, continued combing her hair. Our heroine looked very carefully at her face and saw the maid's blood on it. The girl put her comb on the table and ordered the maids to help her get ready. A new maid, who had just recently arrived in their house, headed towards Anastasia. Our heroine noted to herself that this maid's eyes were exactly like her mother's. For some time, the girl sat silently and watched the actions of the maid. But after a while, Anastasia decided to ask the maid her name. The maid looked very closely at her mistress and timidly said that her name was Ellie Smith. After this, the girl silently continued to comb our heroine's hair. Anastasia looked very carefully at the maid and said that she had a very common name. Then our heroine asked if Eli's family had any title. The maid replied that her father was a baronet, but unfortunately, this title was not hereditary. Anastasia asked, very surprised, why Eli worked as a servant, since her family clearly had money. The maid replied that she had many brothers, so she learned to live independently. Our heroine was glad that Eli came to their house, because now she could just communicate with her. The maid added the finishing touches to the girl's hairstyle and said that the look was completely ready. Anastasia looked at herself in the mirror and was completely satisfied with her image. Our heroine turned to Eli and thanked her for her help in packing. After this, the girl went to dinner, saying that from now on, the maid would always get her ready for events. Anastasia looked at Eli again very carefully and was glad to meet him. Our heroine hurried to dinner, as she wanted to arrive in the hall before Theodore. The prince approached the entrance to the guest hall and understood that he would try to ignore his bride. Having collected his thoughts, he opened the door, not imagining what awaited him. Entering the living room, he saw Anastasia, who was already sitting at the table and waiting for him. The man looked through the girl, not noticing her at all and ignoring her. Theodore sat and silently ate his dinner, and our heroine said that she was glad to dine with a man at the same table. Anastasia chirped and said that she had not seen her fiancé for a long time, since he was always busy and worked a lot. But the prince did not answer our heroine and was completely absorbed in his dinner. The girl fell silent and began to watch the man's actions very carefully. Anastasia didn't know how to behave and began to talk about how her day went. But Theodore didn't seem to care, and so he continued to slowly cut his steak and eat it. Our heroine understood that she needed to somehow attract the prince's attention, but the girl didn't know how to do this, so she fell silent again for a while. The prince was glad of the silence and exhaled calmly, realizing that his plan was working. But Anastasia was very angry about this whole situation, so she threw her fork and knife onto the plate. Theodore clearly did not expect this from the girl and was shocked by her behavior. He looked very carefully at his bride, not understanding what she wanted from him. Realizing that she had managed to attract the prince's attention, the girl continued her conversation with him. Tears began to flow from our heroine's eyes, and she said that the prince was clearly thinking about some other woman right now. Anastasia said that she loves him, but he treats her like a nobody. Theodore was very angry at his fiancé's words, because he understood that she was deliberately trying to provoke his emotions. Memories of the day when she came to his office holding Sergei's shirt in her hands appeared before the prince's eyes. The man again remembered our heroine's words that she would take revenge on him. He understood that the girl was pretending and would do anything to make him believe that her feelings were real. Theodore looked at Anastasia again, fully aware that she would never love him. Therefore, without thinking twice, the prince told our heroine not to make ridiculous remarks to him. After all, the man is not in the mood to communicate with her today, and he does not like all this. Realizing that Theodore was not falling for all her tricks, the girl began to act differently. Anastasia took a fork from the table and said that he would have to communicate with her, because there would be a ball tomorrow. Our heroine stabbed her fork into the steak with all her might and reminded the man that he would have to give her the first dance. After all, no matter what the prince says, she is still his legal bride. The man looked at the girl very carefully and understood that she did not feel love for him, and if this continues, he is afraid that he will lose the ability to distinguish truth from lies. But Anastasia still couldn't calm down, and unexpectedly for Theodore, she got up from the table. Our heroine approached the prince and very gently ran her hand over his face. The girl turned the groom's head in her direction and met his eyes. After this, Anastasia very quickly sat on his lap and leaned towards his lips. Theodore froze in anticipation, and our heroine only smirked at this. The kiss did not take place, but the girl, looking at her fiancé, whispered again that she loved him. The prince began to breathe more quickly. Beads of sweat appeared on his face from excitement, and Anastasia noticed this. Our heroine immediately stood up and said that the man was clearly not feeling well today, so she decided to end today's dinner here. After that, the girl very quickly headed towards the exit, and Theodore never said a word. The prince went to his office and constantly thought about Anastasia and her behavior today. At some point, Evan came in and said he had news. Theodore folded his arms and said that he was ready to listen to his advisor. Evan said he tried his best and learned something about Duke Everdeen. But since he was patronized by the Emperor himself, this task was quite difficult, especially when he was trying to find out at least some information about the murder of Father Theodore. After all, as it turns out, the more dubious the circumstances, the fewer details emerge. After the murder, all information related to the case miraculously disappeared, and punishing the Duke for his actions according to the law will be very difficult and almost impossible. But if they resort to some other method, then they might succeed. The prince looked at Evan very carefully and asked what he was planning. The advisor immediately responded that there were rumors that Duke Everdeen had a drug addiction. Theodore thought about the information he had just heard and did not immediately believe it. But then Evan hastened to assure the prince that all this was the pure truth, because he had received this information from reliable sources. Theodore looked at the man very seriously and went over his next steps in his head. The advisor said that the Duke had been a reckless man before, and with the death of the previous prince, the situation had only worsened. Evan then went on to say very angrily that he would never forgive this hated Everdeen, and he believes that everyone who bears this name deserves only death. Theodore noted to himself that his hatred for their kind was similar to that felt by Evan. But for some reason this time, the prince could not agree with his advisor. Here the man pulled himself together and asked what drug they were talking about. Evan said it was Asalium, as its supply had increased in recent years. Theodore knew about such a plant, because many people had felt its effect on themselves. The thing is that Asalium is often used in medicine because it has a relaxing effect on the body. The prince understood that if the herb was used for non-medical purposes, everything could end badly. After all, there was a punishment for this, and in the best case, you would be sent to hard labor, and in the worst case, you would be burned at the stake. Theodore thought about what to do next, and how to cleverly set up the Duke. But first, he asked Ian in what form Everdeen took them, seeds or leaves. The advisor replied, "Leaves," and they both knew that might not be enough. The prince also asked what dosage the Duke was using. Evan replied that it was about 15 ounces over the course of 6 months for sure. Theodore said that even if the matter were put into action, this amount was within acceptable limits. But you can try mixing this drug with tobacco leaves to somehow increase the amount consumed. The prince said that they would creep up carefully so as not to be noticed. To do this, you need to bribe suppliers and start gradually mixing in something else instead of Asalium leaves. What causes strong addiction, and whose leaves will be most similar to tobacco, because they cannot know for sure that the supplier will not betray them or set them up. The next day arrived, and Theodore and Anastasia arrived at the imperial ball. The prince looked at our heroine and understood that if he destroyed the Duke, she would perish along with him. Theodore noted to himself that for once his cherished wish was about to come true. But for some reason, he didn't feel any joy from this, and overall, he felt somehow bad. While the man was thinking about all this, music started playing, and he and Anastasia began to dance. From the outside, their couple looked simply magnificent. They looked at each other and seemed to be in love. Theodore, while dancing, accidentally met the eyes of our heroine, and the girl very timidly and at the same time very tenderly whispered that she loved him. After this, Anastasia became coquettishly embarrassed and moved a little closer to the prince. The man again began to succumb to our heroine's tricks, so he closed his eyes for a second. But when Theodore opened them, he again saw the image of our heroine, who was smiling at him. Suddenly, the prince's attention was drawn to a completely different figure that stood behind the girl. It was Duke Everdeen who was watching the pair very closely. Noticing Theodore's gaze on him, the man's lips spread into a sly smile. At this point, Anastasia told her fiancé that she was feeling unwell and therefore wanted to go out onto the terrace. Our heroine looked at Theodore and said that she would rest for a little while and return immediately. The girl turned around and walked very quickly out of the dance hall, and the prince, very surprised by her behavior, watched his bride go. Then, behind Theodore's back, a voice that he hated painfully heard and greeted him. The prince replied that they had not met for a long time, but the Duke had not changed at all. Everdeen smiled, and Theodore noted that the man looked as cheerful as always. The Duke looked at the prince and said that he was always young at heart. That's why he looked that way. But after this, the man added that this is Theodore's merit, because he takes excellent care of his people. Everdeen decided to change the subject and said that it seemed to him that the prince and his niece had become a little distant from each other, and he could have influenced the girl as her relative. But Theodore, hearing this, only grinned. The Duke did not back down and said that he was ready to do it from the bottom of his heart, for the sake of the family. But the prince said that this was a very bold statement for a man who was not even Anastasia's father. The man said that he, however, treasured the girl as his own daughter. It's just that Anastasia is still a little shy about her feelings for her fiancé and her relationship with him. Theodore found it funny to listen to all this feigned concern, so he smiled. But the Duke continued, and reminded the prince that the girl had lost her entire family, and he, as her guardian, was worried about her health. Everdeen said that Anastasia had come to his home as an adult, and therefore had not received a proper upbringing. She resembles her mother in her incredible beauty, but unfortunately, that is where her merits end. But the Duke immediately added that he did not mean that the girl was terrible in everything else. But he thinks that our heroine could use some manners. And since his residence is located very close to Theodore's residence, he thinks of inviting Anastasia to his place, but only in order to communicate with her more and to take care of her upbringing. The prince stood silently, looked at the man, and did not react to his words. After this, the Duke smiled again, somewhat sarcastically, and asked Theodore if he would refuse him this. The prince turned around silently, and deciding not to answer Everdeen, stepped aside. But the Duke was clearly not satisfied with all this, so he very quickly grabbed Theodore by the hand. The prince turned around, and the man asked him if he was not going to answer him. Theodore looked at Everdeen very carefully, and did not understand what answer he wanted to hear from him. Therefore, without thinking twice, the prince, with a sharp movement of his hand, pulled his hand away. For some reason, the Duke's offer irritated Theodore, and he wanted to refuse him. But the prince, alas, had no reason to refuse, and so he said that Everdeen could do whatever he wanted. After these words, Theodore turned around and very quickly began to move away from the Duke he hated. He took one last look at the man, still not understanding why he had started this whole conversation. And the Duke, who was clearly pleased with the prince's answer, smiled and looked after him. Theodore realized that he was very tired and wanted to find Anastasia as quickly as possible to return home with her. The prince looked around the room very carefully, not understanding where our heroine had gone. But then his gaze fell on the terrace, and he remembered that the girl had gone to the balcony. The man slowly walked there, opened the door, and called out to Anastasia. But then he saw a terrible picture that plunged him into great shock. Our heroine stood at the railing and almost completely leaned down from the balcony. The girl did not notice Theodore and stood right on the very edge, motionless. The prince was very afraid for Anastasia and therefore shouted her name very loudly. The man ran up to our heroine very quickly and grabbed her hand sharply. The girl didn't have time to do anything and was very shocked by Theodore's actions. The prince, with all the anxiety in his voice, asked if it was true that she was going to jump. Anastasia, who still didn't understand what had happened, stood in silence for a while. But the man was clearly not satisfied with all this, so he asked his question again. Our heroine opened her mouth in amazement and fear at the same time, and she hastened to tell her fiancé that she had not intended to jump down. She had just dropped one of her favorite earrings and was trying to find it. Theodore exhaled calmly, realizing that it had all just seemed that way to him, and Anastasia froze in mute silence, digesting this whole situation in her head. The prince looked down so as not to see the confused expression on our heroine's face, and turning around, he told the girl that they were going home now, because he was tired. Anastasia did not answer her fiancé, and simply followed him silently. When our heroine came home, she remembered the situation on the balcony and did not understand why Theodore was worried about her. The girl thought that perhaps the prince was afraid that if his bride committed suicide at the ball, his name would be disgraced. Anastasia never found the second earring, so she put the remaining one in the box and put it away. At that moment, Eli entered our heroine's room and asked if she was ready to visit the Duke's house. Anastasia replied that yes, but the maid noticed that her mistress looked somewhat upset. Our heroine said that she was simply worried, because she didn't know why exactly she was being called there. Ellie said that she was sure that the occasion would definitely be joyful, but for some reason, Anastasia was not sure of this, since she had never been invited to say something nice. The maid said that she assured our heroine that this time everything would be different, and Eli also promised that when Anastasia returned, she would make hot chocolate and keep her company. The next day, our heroine went to her uncle's mansion. Even though Eli had convinced her that the conversation would be about something good, she, like no one else, should know that this was simply impossible. Therefore, the girl very reluctantly approached the doors that led to the Duke's office. Having gathered all her strength and prepared herself for a serious conversation, Anastasia opened the door. Entering the office, our heroine said that she had come because her uncle had called her to him. The girl saw that the Duke was sitting with some unknown girl. Here, Anastasia felt some very strange and sharp smell, and it clearly smelled like drugs. Our heroine was scared. Did her uncle really intend to force her to smoke this crap with him? Fearing all this, the girl timidly asked what the Duke wanted from her. The uncle was in no hurry to answer, so he picked up the pipe, smoked, and calmly blew out the smoke. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at Anastasia, asking if she had already spent the night with Prince Redford. Our heroine clearly did not expect such a question, and therefore said that she did not understand what her uncle was talking about. The girl who was sitting with the Duke repeated the question he had asked her, and after that, she laughed and added that it was really so difficult to understand without unnecessary explanations. Anastasia became very angry and asked again what they both meant. The woman looked very carefully at our heroine and said that it seemed that she still did not understand anything. Then she laughed and said that Anastasia was absolutely no use. Here, our heroine's uncle shouted at her that she was a blockhead and that he was disappointed in her. After all, the Duke hoped that Anastasia was not so stupid and would become pregnant by the prince. But he realized that he had overestimated our heroine, and she was just a talentless woman who could not seduce a man. Anastasia clenched her fists in anger and said that even though she was an orphan without a proper upbringing, she was still the daughter of an aristocrat. And she at least knows how humiliating it is to be in such a relationship with a man before marriage. Moreover, she did not want to enter into this relationship with Prince Redford because she did not love him. Our heroine did not understand how she deserved such disrespectful attitude towards herself, and she said that, taking into account the words spoken by the Duke, the girl concluded that for him she was something like a prostitute. After these words, a dead and prolonged silence hung in the room. The expression on Anastasia's face showed that she was very angry with her uncle. Meanwhile, the Duke and his friend looked at our heroine with great surprise. And then her uncle said that the girl was saying some very strange things. After all, in his opinion, Anastasia is absolutely no different from a prostitute. Our heroine was very shocked by what she heard from her uncle. Then a girl approached Anastasia and said that she would now dispel her misconceptions. After all, our heroine is nothing more than an expensive prostitute from whom they bought her body, and all this was done in order to contain and control Prince Redford. The stranger looked at Anastasia and asked what else she suggested calling someone who sells their body. Our heroine got tired of hearing all this, and so she shouted that all this was not true. But the girl looked at Anastasia and said that she was sure that she was no longer a virgin. Here our heroine clenched her fists in anger and said that she was still innocent. But the stranger only grinned and said that in the end, Anastasia would spend the night with the prince. And after all this, our heroine will definitely become pregnant and give birth to Theodore's child. Then she will become the prince's wife. And all this is no different from selling virginity. Anastasia was silent and understood that the girl was telling the truth, because from the outside it looked exactly like that. Our heroine became sad and realized that she had a difficult future with the prince. At that moment, the Duke looked at Anastasia and said that she just needed to spread her legs for Theodore, just as she had parted them for that dead knight named Sergei. At the mere mention of her lover's name, our heroine was stunned. But when she came to her senses, she screamed that she had not been in such a relationship with Sergei. The Duke and his friend were shocked by what they heard, because they were sure that Anastasia was not a virgin. Tears began to flow from our heroine's eyes, because she again remembered her beloved. After all, he was Anastasia's only true and joyful love. Our heroine hissed through her teeth that she would not dare to defame the name of her beloved. And she added that there are things that are simply not permissible to talk about. At this point, Anastasia's uncle couldn't stand it any longer, and, saying that she was an arrogant girl, threw his pipe at her. The tube didn't reach our heroine and fell on the floor, right in front of her feet. The girl lowered her eyes to the floor, and the Duke called his servants, ordering them to take off her clothes. Anastasia was shocked by her uncle's order and looked at him in surprise. At this time, the Duke pointed his finger at our heroine, saying that he would beat all this nonsense out of her. Uncle shouted at her to remember that she was a common prostitute and not a human being. At this time, the servants flew up to the girl and began to undress her very quickly. The Duke shouted to Anastasia not to forget who had put her in this place. Our heroine stood naked in front of her uncle and his friend, because the servants had taken off all her clothes. The girl looked at the Duke with horror, not understanding why he was doing this to her. But then Anastasia realized that these people really didn't even accept her as a human being. After all the horror she had experienced in her uncle's house, the girl got into the carriage and went home. Our heroine drove and replayed the entire situation in her head. The girl covered her face with her hands and understood that she would gather strength and take revenge on her uncle. Anastasia clearly realized that she would cause the Duke more pain than anyone had ever experienced. Our heroine will make him, together with Theodore, the most unhappy person in the world. While the girl was thinking about revenge, the carriage arrived at the residence of Prince Redford. The door opened, and Anastasia very timidly went out into the street, afraid of meeting anyone. Our heroine wanted to forget this whole day and everything that happened to her as a nightmare. The girl approached the door of the house with very uncertain and slow steps. The last thing Anastasia wanted right now was to see and talk to anyone. Our heroine understood that Eli was supposed to meet her, but when she saw no one, she breathed a sigh of relief. The girl even began to smile, realizing that she had gone unnoticed. All Anastasia wanted was to go back to her room now, while no one was there. Then Eli appeared behind our heroine and said that she was glad to see her back. The maid came closer to her mistress and smiled, saying that she had not had time to meet her at the carriage. Anastasia looked at Eli and, seeing her appearance, said that she had to tidy herself up before going out to the mistress. The maid clearly did not expect such rudeness from our heroine and asked her for forgiveness. Anastasia replied that this time she would pretend that nothing had happened, but next time she would not forgive her for it. Ellie followed her mistress into the room and said that in any case, she was glad to have her back. The girl smiled broadly and promised to warm up the hot chocolate and bring it. But Anastasia understood that if she talked, she would definitely start crying. But she couldn't let anyone see her tears now. Therefore, our heroine silently and very quickly headed to her room. Eli said that she would now wash her hands and would definitely help the girl change her clothes. But Anastasia replied that she was able to change into a dressing gown herself. Eli wanted to object to the owner, but she again confidently said that she did not need help. The maid had no choice but to bow to her mistress and leave. Anastasia entered the room, closed the door behind her, and felt uneasy about having to be rude to Eli. Our heroine exhaled and realized that it was finally all over, and she could now calmly change her clothes. But then the door to the room opened and Eli ran in, saying that she had an urgent message. The maid looked closely at her mistress and froze in horror. There was not a single undamaged spot on Anastasia's back, because she was covered in abrasions. Eli couldn't help but scream in horror and surprise, but immediately covered her mouth with her hands. Our heroine felt uneasy about frightening the maid and asked her to leave. But Eli didn't move from her place and asked where Anastasia got these wounds from. Our heroine replied that it didn't matter, and at that moment the maid closed the door of the room more tightly. Eli couldn't leave her mistress alone and asked her what had happened to her. But Anastasia clearly didn't like all this, and she shouted for the maid to leave the room. Eli replied that she couldn't leave silently after everything she had seen. Our heroine looked very carefully at the maid, not understanding why she did not listen to her orders. Here Anastasia thought to herself that Eli, when he gets angry, reminds her of her mother. But this thought and these memories made our heroine very sad. Anastasia was silent. She understood that if she said anything now, she would burst into tears. Eli said that she did not see these scratches on our heroine's body in the morning. And coming closer, she said that she did not understand where so many of them came from. But then it dawned on the maid that all these injuries appeared after Anastasia's visit to the Duke's residence. Eli looked at our heroine and was horrified by the thought that all these beatings were inflicted on her by her uncle. Anastasia realized that the maid had guessed everything, and so she simply closed her eyes silently, holding back her tears. All these thoughts made Eli feel uneasy, so she covered her mouth with her hands so as not to ask unnecessary questions. But then the girl still asked if it was true that the Duke had done all this to her. Anastasia was silent, and the maid, horrified, asked if she often went through this. Our heroine grinned and asked what Eli had to do with all this. Anastasia angrily asked if she had understood correctly that the maid felt sorry for her. But then our heroine said that Eli had no right to feel sorry for her. The maid stood silently, not understanding why her mistress was so cruel to her. Out of hurt, Eli began to cry, saying that her mistress was mistaken, because everyone has the right to worry about someone. Anastasia felt sorry for the girl, and so she extended her hands to her. And the maid said that it is human nature to sympathize with the pain of one's neighbor. After that, Eli helped our heroine change her clothes and tidy herself up. Anastasia, seeing the concern and excitement of the maid, informed her that she was fine. But the girl said that no one can be okay after something like that. Eli's eyes filled with tears, and she said that our heroine could show her emotions. Anastasia was very wary of the maid's words, because she was not used to trusting people. And so, our heroine asked how long Eli would pretend to worry about her. The maid tried to tell her something, but Anastasia screamed at the girl to keep quiet before she cut her mouth open. But Eli did not remain silent, and replied that from now on, she would help her dress, at least until the wounds healed. Anastasia got angry and stepped aside, telling the maid to stop pretending to worry about her. But Eli cried out that she was not pretending at all, and was truly very worried. The girl looked at the maid and thought again that her eyes were exactly like her mother's eyes, and she was pretending to understand her. But if they get closer now, it will be difficult for our heroine to push her away. Anastasia remembered that Eli came to her room with some kind of report and asked what she wanted to tell. The maid became very animated and said that Theodore was inviting our heroine to have dinner together. The girl was not as happy as Eli, and she dryly replied that she would come for dinner. The maid decided that Anastasia needed a new hairstyle, so she began to comb her hair. Eli said that if our heroine didn't do anything irreparable, then she has the right to happiness. And after this, the maid added that she sincerely wished the girl happiness. Anastasia did not expect to hear these words from Eli, and therefore froze in surprise. The maid laughed and said that she looked like an eccentric from the outside, but from the first meeting, she wished our heroine happiness. The girl noted to herself that if she had met Eli outside the Redford residence, they could have become friends. But in this house, Anastasia could not trust anyone, and did not want to become attached to anyone. When the image of our heroine was completely ready, she told the maid that she was going to dinner. As she left her room, the girl felt sad that she had no friends. After her father hanged himself, Anastasia's life came to an end. Our heroine sat at the table with Theodore and said that she was very glad to hear about the invitation to dinner. But the prince answered the girl that he was not going to listen to all this nonsense. Anastasia made a surprised face and said that she couldn't believe her ears. After all, the man finally paid attention to her and spoke to her. Theodore remained silent and handed our heroine some strange letter. After this, the prince said that this letter was from the Duke, and it was addressed to him. The girl was very surprised and asked why he was giving her this letter. The man replied that he did not understand who the Duke thought he was. After these words, Theodore looked at Anastasia very attentively and seriously, and he added that he was furious that the Duke had dared to send a prostitute to his house. Our heroine was shocked by what she heard, and did not understand what her uncle had written to him. The girl began to quickly read the letter, which stated that she had not received a proper upbringing due to one incident in her childhood. Anastasia crumpled the letter and noted to herself that she had not expected her uncle to go so far. A couple of days had passed since that terrible dinner. Our heroine was sitting in her room, and Eli ran into her. The maid told Anastasia that she had a visitor, and a woman entered the room. Our heroine looked at the guest very carefully and remembered her face. It was the same girl who was with her uncle in his office. The woman said that the Duke sent her to Anastasia, and her name was Janet. Eli and our heroine were very shocked by the girl's appearance. Janet said that she was pleased to finally get to know the girl normally. The guest also said that from now on, they would spend a lot of time together. Anastasia was not happy about this meeting and ordered Janet to leave her room. But the girl said that, unfortunately, she could not return, as she had already taken the money. Our heroine ordered Janet to stop talking nonsense and get out immediately. The guest grinned and asked in surprise what Anastasia was so unhappy about. Janet laughed, saying that she had cost the Duke a pretty penny, and not everyone could afford to pay for her services. Anastasia was shocked that the girl dared to insult her in her own home. That's why our heroine, shouting for Janet to get out, swung at her. The guest grabbed the girl's hand and said that she really lacked manners. Janet reported that the Duke was right when he called Anastasia a cheeky girl, and saying that she herself didn't want to be here. The guest pushed our heroine away. The girl stumbled and fell to the floor, and Eli, frightened, ran up to her. Janet said with disdain that Anastasia had nothing but a name, but she had so much pride. She also added that our heroine is also not lacking in arrogance. After this, Janet laughed, and looking at the girl, she realized that she did not expect to hear this from her. After all, if it weren't for Duke Everdene's request, she wouldn't have set foot here. Anastasia was very angry, but she stood still, and Janet began to look around the room. Here the guest told our heroine that they are actually very similar. Moreover, she had already received the money anyway, and they wouldn't be able to ignore the Duke. Anastasia understood that the girl was right, but she still wanted to object to her. But Janet laughed and told our heroine that she was suggesting that she stop winding herself up and live for pleasure. Then the girl asked Eli to lock the door so that no one would come in. After this, Anastasia came across her favorite candlestick, which she so often used to beat her servants. Janet suspected something was wrong and looked at our heroine with fear. Anastasia smiled and said that, surprisingly, they actually had something in common. After all, she also loves to enjoy life, only in her own way. Janet quickly turned around and looked at our heroine in shock and fear. Anastasia's expression was a little crazy, and she said that she would now be happy to stretch a little for her own pleasure. Janet asked our heroine in a trembling voice if she wasn't afraid of the Duke at all. After all, the guest was Uncle Anastasia's favorite, but the girl didn't care, and she swung the candlestick. After this, our heroine silently and without emotion looked at Janet. Anastasia was clearly going crazy, but the guest realized this a little later than she should have. She knew firsthand that people like our heroine are much more terrible than those who have power. Anastasia turned to Janet and asked if she now knew her place. Our heroine also said that she is not a prostitute, and she has nothing in common with the girl, so she has nothing to learn from her. Anastasia said that she would not kill Janet, but in exchange she would fulfill her request, and the guest had no right to refuse. Theodore sat in his office and remembered the day when he told Anastasia about the Duke's letter. That day, for the first time, our heroine stood up silently from the table and left the room, and the prince watched with great pleasure as Anastasia's face gradually turned pale. At that moment, Anastasia, who he was thinking about now, knocked on Theodore's office and entered. The prince did not expect this visit, and therefore looked very carefully at our heroine. The girl stood there silently for a while, and the man, unable to bear it, asked what she wanted. Anastasia, as always, smiled very sweetly and said that she had a small request. Theodore smirked and said that it seemed like none of the Everdeens knew shame, since they were turning to him for help after all this. Our heroine did not argue with the prince and said that if he says so, then it is true. The man said that he hoped that the girl would not do something stupid again. Anastasia laughed and said that circumstances forced her to do stupid things all the time. Theodore was silent, and in anger, he clutched the pen on the chair he was sitting on. Here, the prince loosened his grip and thought that he felt simply disgusting. The man is tired of dealing with our heroine, and he is so tired of it that he doesn't even have the strength to get angry. Theodore looked at the girl very carefully, not understanding what she wanted from him. Suddenly, the prince remembered the day when he saw her looking at something from the balcony. After that, a picture popped into his head of Anastasia standing in his office and promising revenge. Our heroine called out to him and said that she wanted to ask his permission so that Janet could stay longer. Theodore looked at the girl and asked if that was all, or if she wanted to ask for something else. The prince grinned and said that he thought Anastasia was doing well alone. Our heroine laughed and said that she had no intention of sending her to Theodore's bedroom. After this, the girl leaned on the table and approached Theodore. Anastasia was so close that the prince lost the power of speech for a moment, and she stroked his face. The man looked at her, and the girl said that she had not been able to get a personal servant, so Janet could take this place. Theodore dryly replied to our heroine that she could do whatever she wanted. Anastasia was glad to hear this, and so she kissed the prince on the cheek. After this, our heroine thanked the man and left his office. Theodore wished the girl a good day and digested her behavior in his head. The girl walked down the corridor and felt complete disgust towards the prince. She didn't think that a simple kiss on the cheek would be so difficult for her and would be so disgusting to her. Another day came. Anastasia was sitting in her office and waiting for Janet. But when the girl came to her, our heroine was shocked by her appearance. Janet was beautiful, and Anastasia asked her to be less noticeable. She bowed to our heroine and promised to dress more simply. A week has already passed since the girl arrived at the prince's residence. While running from Duke Everdeen's mansion to Theodore's mansion, Jeanette began spying for Anastasia. Formally, for everyone, she came to take care of our heroine's upbringing. But rumors began to circulate among the servants that one madwoman had brought another into the house. Anastasia and Janet sat at the table, drank tea, and discussed what the servants were whispering behind their backs. Here our heroine looked very carefully at Eli, asking if she was telling anyone about her. The maid did not expect such a question, and said that she would not dare to do such a thing. Anastasia asked whether Eli was telling the truth, and watched her reaction. The maid said that she swears, because she knows how unfairly everyone treats our heroine. Anastasia came close to Eli and looked straight into her eyes. After this, our heroine smiled and said that she wished a speedy death not only for Everdeen, but also for Redford. The maid was shocked by what she heard and looked at Anastasia very carefully, and our heroine continued to talk about how these two families doomed her to suffering. Therefore, there is no talk of any hope. They only plunged the girl deeper and deeper into despair. After all, these two, in Anastasia's opinion, turned her life into a real hell. Our heroine said that she didn't need to do anything. She could just watch and wait for them to destroy themselves. Eli was shocked by all this, and the girl looked through her at Janet. Anastasia turned to her and asked what they should do to destroy both men. Janet said that now would probably be the best time to escalate their conflict. Our heroine looked at the girl very carefully and said that it was a good idea. And the girl wants Janet to do something very important and serious for her. Anastasia said that there would be nothing difficult to do, and that she would just need to flirt a little. Our heroine added that, in general, she didn't think that anything more could be demanded from Janet. The girl clearly knew how much influence both Redford and Everdeen had. So Anastasia wants Janet to whisper to the Duke about Theodore's current situation. Of course, our heroine has doubts that anyone will listen to the words of a prostitute, but suddenly they will be lucky. After this, Anastasia said that she knew that the Duke was taking drugs, and she said that perhaps Janet should start taking them with him. But they just need to start using something more serious than what he's been using so far. After all, according to Anastasia and Janet, he will certainly lose his vigilance. And sooner or later, the Duke will certainly blurt out something unnecessary to the girl. Although this was not in Anastasia's plans, her plan turned out to be very useful for Theodore. But for now, the prince did not know what his bride was going to do. Theodore had been sitting in his office lately, spending a huge amount of time reminiscing about the past. These memories were mostly about what Everdeen and the Emperor had taken from him. Reliving his childhood and past every time, Theodore vowed to take revenge. Only the thirst for revenge burning within him was able to bring him back to reality. At least that was the case until recently. But recently, completely different thoughts began to visit his head. About Anastasia. The prince was very angry that our heroine appeared in his dreams every night without exception. In his dreams, she was constantly laughing and was very sweet to her fiancé. In another dream, Anastasia walked up to Theodore and stroked his cheek. Our heroine sat on his lap and whispered that she loved him very much. The girl, unexpectedly for the man, kissed him very passionately on the lips. The prince clearly did not expect this from Anastasia, and therefore looked at her in surprise. But our heroine did not stop and stroked her fiancé's neck, continuing to kiss him. The girl, with a very quick movement of her hand, threw Theodore's jacket onto the floor. Anastasia pulled away from the prince, and looking at him, asked if he loved her. The man understood that he had fallen for our heroine's hook, because he felt something for her. But realizing this, Theodore immediately closed his eyes, hoping that he would wake up and this would all end. The girl did not disappear, and unbuttoned her dress, which exposed her breasts. Anastasia hugged her fiancé very tightly to her beautiful and young body, and he was shocked by this unexpected and strange behavior of our heroine. Theodore closed his eyes again, but it did nothing to help him wake up. And then the prince began to act. Without thinking twice, he laid the girl on the table and was already ready to take possession of her. The man realized that the idea of sleeping with Anastasia was not disgusting to him. For a moment, Theodore even felt like he had completely lost his mind. And at that moment, the door to the prince's office opened and Evan entered. The man opened his eyes in horror and looked at his advisor, not understanding what was happening. The creaking sound of the door brought him back to his senses, as if someone had splashed cold water on him. Theodore finally realized that everything that happened was just a dream. For a moment, the prince even thought that he had gone mad, and from these thoughts, he squeezed the pen in his hand and broke it. But after a second, the man calmed himself down, because nothing had happened, and Evan shouldn't have noticed his excitement. Theodore looked at the advisor and remembered that they had agreed to discuss an important matter. But Evan stood silently, and the prince tried to pretend that everything was fine with him. The advisor looked very closely at his master and reported that they had tracked down a tobacco trading company. Theodore didn't believe it right away and decided to ask again if he had heard correctly. Evan replied that he was correct and that the firm was posing as a regular trading company. The prince chuckled and decided that their conscience was bothering them, since they decided to open up to them. The advisor said that, however, the scale of the company is much larger than he expected, since they openly purchase medicines. Theodore realized that if they were normal, they would try to hide for some time. which meant that Everdeen was patronizing them. Our hero immediately remembered Anastasia, whom he had just seen in a dream, and he felt uneasy. But Evan, not noticing the prince's embarrassment, continued, saying that bribing or infiltrating the company would be a very difficult task. Theodore realized that the Duke was far more vigilant than he had imagined. The prince understood that Everdeen was only using his pawns, which he could immediately get rid of if necessary. He clearly promised the company's owners his patronage, which is why they are not afraid to work so openly. Evan said that it was. And what's more, the company itself was based in the Duke's territory. The men looked at each other in silence for a while, not knowing how to proceed. Suddenly, Theodore announced that if something went wrong, Everdeen would easily cover the supplies, and this was a problem for them. The advisor lowered his eyes to the floor and said that, in his opinion, the prince was in a great hurry to deal with the Duke. Theodore did not expect such a remark from the advisor and looked at him in surprise. And Evan said that Everdeen is not putting pressure on the prince right now, so why are they in such a hurry? Theodore exhaled very slowly and replied that he had some concerns. After all, the Duke will most likely soon begin to insist on an official marriage, and the prince feels very sick just thinking about all this. And besides, Theodore can't stand the idea of Everdeen walking under the same sky with him. The man looked at the advisor and asked how long he should wait. After all, he is already engaged to this woman, only because he was waiting for the right moment. Evan looked at his master and asked how he felt about starting his own trading company. They will sell the same product at a lower price, enter the market, and wait until the Duke's company's turnover decreases. The prince liked this idea and told the advisor to take charge of organizing this company. After this, and at the same time that Anastasia ordered Janet to use drugs, a new trading company was established. Evan was a very capable subordinate and managed to displace Everdeen's company, increasing the size of Redford's company. While Theodore and the advisor were busy preparing various events, the Duke was already completely mired in addiction. Well, this was not surprising, because his dosage was increased several times. One evening, Everdeen was sitting in his office with Janet, smoking. He behaved very strangely and seemed to be in some parallel world, not noticing anyone around him. Although Janet was born into the lower classes, she always knew how to show herself off in society. The girl at one time had to sell her body to please the Duke's dubious hobbies. But thanks to all this, she was able to gain his support and indulgence. Of course, all this could hardly be called trust, which is why he treated her so terribly. After smoking and noticing the girl next to him, Everdeen handed her a cigarette. Janet knew she had to somehow stay sober until she completed the assignment. While the Duke wasn't looking, she put the drugged cigar in the ashtray. The girl lowered her head onto the man's shoulder and began to cuddle up to him. Janet began to reason that the leaves and seeds had exactly the same effect. But from seeds, it is of course much stronger and comes on faster. The girl understood that if the Duke got used to them, she would have to offer him something else. Everdeen was overcome with renewed vigor, and he caught Janet's attention by pointing his finger somewhere in the air. The man had a wild look in his eyes and said he was looking at the candle flame. Then the Duke added that the flames had taken on the shape of a woman's breast. And after these words, he laughed very loudly. The girl thought to herself that as soon as she finished here, she would immediately move away from these places. Time passed, autumn came, and Uncle stopped inviting Anastasia to his place. One evening, Janet came to visit our heroine with news. The girl said that the Duke no longer needs to be offered drugs, since he asks for them himself. Anastasia said that Janet was doing a great job, because recently there was a fire on her uncle's lands, and he, in a stupor, didn't even notice anything. Our heroine added that perhaps the Duke would soon be somewhere and let it slip. Anastasia's wish soon came true. The Duke was using drugs from Redford's company without knowing it. Everdeen's income was declining daily, and the following year saw record rainfall. The Duke's wife, sensing something was wrong, fled their mansion with her child. Chaos reigned in the ungovernable county, and the inhabitants of the lands also began to flee. Everdeen sought salvation from the Emperor, but he did not extend a helping hand to him. After all, the Duke was clearly going crazy and could very easily blab about all the atrocities he knew about. The Emperor, without thinking twice, decided that it was time to get rid of Everdeen. Therefore, the entire Duke family was immediately accused of countless crimes. Amongst all this was the brutal murder of the previous Prince Redford. For the death of a member of the imperial family in particular, and for other sins, the Count was sentenced to death. Those members of his family, who in the Emperor's opinion were involved in the crime, were executed along with him. with the exception of Anastasia, who was not an accomplice. The girl was glad that she managed to avoid the death penalty, even though she was a member of their family. One day, our heroine got into a carriage and went to the place where the massacre of her relatives took place. All of the Everdeens sentenced to death were beheaded and put on public display. The girl, having arrived at the place, looked very carefully at her uncle's head. The picture was actually very horrifying, and few people could look at it calmly. But seeing all this, Anastasia was finally able to laugh heartily. Realizing that she was no longer in danger from her uncle, the girl breathed a sigh of relief. She finally got her revenge on the Duke, and now she can take on Theodore. The Everdeen line, to the delight of some and to their surprise, fell without much difficulty. But despite all this, people did not look at Anastasia any differently. People continued to call our heroine a girl of easy virtue, of aristocratic origin, and an orphan. And now the girl had no relatives, and not even patrons. She was left alone and was Theodore's hated fiancée named Anastasia. Days passed after the execution of the Everdeen family, and our heroine, as before, sat in the Redford estate. The girl sat alone in the room, drinking tea, reflecting on her life. The fact that only one of her tormentors died did not change much for Anastasia, but nevertheless, our heroine was glad that everything ended this way. And it was now that the girl finally enjoyed temporary satisfaction. Theodore, meanwhile, was going through the worst of his days. After all, the prince's patience gradually wore thin over time. The man went to balls with Anastasia and pretended that everything was fine with them, although in his heart he hated her, as before. Theodore saw how calmly our heroine met people's criticism. The girl's face showed no emotion at all when people insulted her, and all this, for some reason, invariably spoiled the prince's mood. When they returned home after dinner parties, the man lay alone in his room for a very long time with his eyes closed. Thoughts that he sympathized with Anastasia began to visit his head more and more often. At another dinner party, the couple danced, and from the outside it seemed like everything was going well for them. But in fact, during the dance, Theodore asked our heroine if it was time for her to show at least a little decency and step back. The girl kept silent, keeping the intrigue, and the prince was very irritated by all this. Then Anastasia, smiling, said very sarcastically that she would not leave his side for a single step. And she added just as playfully that she loved the man with all her heart. Theodore, hearing these words and seeing the girl's reaction, became very angry. Without thinking twice, the prince took our heroine by the shoulders and pushed her away from him. The man no longer wanted to dance with Anastasia, so he quickly left the hall. Our heroine really liked her fiancé's reaction, and so she always tried to follow him to make him nervous. From that evening onwards, Theodore made one important decision for himself and began dancing at balls with other girls. Anastasia entertained herself all these evenings with a glass of wine. Our heroine watched the prince and understood that she didn't really care who exactly he would meet with. But it seemed to her that the man had completely forgotten about her warning and his thirst for revenge. But the girl herself remembered this very well and was ready to wait as long as necessary. At this evening, Theodore had already danced with almost all the girls, and Anastasia did not understand why he was hesitating. Then, out of nowhere, a stranger appeared and headed straight towards the prince. Our heroine froze in bewilderment, because she had never seen her at balls before. Meanwhile, the stranger, very confidently, approached the man closer and closer. The girl was very beautiful, stately, and clearly from a very noble family. Stopping, she slowly opened her eyes and looked closely at Theodore. He, dumbfounded, looked at her in response, but could not utter a word. So the girl smiled and spoke first, saying that her name was Evelyn Stewart. The stranger then said that she was of course embarrassed to suggest such a thing at the first meeting, but she hoped that the prince would dance with her. The man watched the girl's movements very carefully and did not immediately understand the request. But when he came to his senses, he replied that he would be happy to invite Evelyn to dance. Their hands touched each other very slowly and with some tenderness. Anastasia, who was watching all this from the side, was stunned by what she saw. And then she was very happy, because our heroine realized that Theodore had finally found the one. Anastasia's eyes lit up with happiness, because she simply had no doubt that Evelyn would become dear to him. After all, the prince had never behaved so timidly and childishly in front of anyone. The girl was amused by all this. She laughed loudly, and our heroine knew that the man would fall madly in love with her. Anastasia was so happy that she couldn't take her mocking gaze off the couple. She realized that she had finally found a match for her fiancé, and she remembered what type of women he liked. Here, our heroine's gaze changed, and she remembered her beloved Sergei. She was overcome with anger because she wanted revenge and could not let Theodore live a peaceful life. The prince noticed Anastasia's angry gaze on him, and fearing trouble, decided that they needed to leave the event. He turned to Mrs. Stewart, unexpectedly for her and for himself, inviting her to his mansion. Theodore didn't understand how these words came out of his mouth, and he was afraid that he might offend his new acquaintance. He knew he said it because of Anastasia's intense gaze, and because he was afraid she would flare up. Evelyn stood silently, as if seriously considering the prince's proposal. Then the girl exhaled, smiled, and replied that she agreed, because it would be great. Theodore clearly did not expect such an answer. He was Mrs. Stewart, but he could no longer take back his invitation. The prince, Evelyn, and Anastasia immediately went to the Redford residence. Theodore opened the door to his room and invited his new acquaintance to come in. Our heroine, who was slowly following them, was surprised that the man invited the girl not to the living room, but to the bedroom. Anastasia stood still and watched as the prince and his new acquaintance disappeared behind the doors of the room. Theodore poured Evelyn some tea, and she said that he had really helped her out with his invitation. The prince looked at the girl in great surprise, not understanding what she meant, and she laughed and said that she had wanted to meet Theodore for a long time. After this, Mrs. Stewart, continuing to smile, looked very sweetly at the man. The couple sat at the table, drank tea, and remained silent for some time after the girl's confession. Theodore thought about what to answer his new acquaintance and gathered his strength for the conversation. He closed his eyes and said that he had not called Mrs. Stewart for a romantic get-together. Evelyn replied that she immediately realized that he was not interested in her in that way. Then she looked very closely at the prince and said that she was not interested in him as a man either. Our hero was very surprised by what he heard and asked why she had agreed to go with him then. The girl looked down, brought the cup to her lips, and smiled very slyly. Mrs. Stewart looked at Theodore and said that she just wanted to see him. Then she added that for a long time she had heard talk about the prince. The man was shocked at first by what he heard, but then he thought that he did not remember any friendship between their families. There was silence at the table for a while, and the couple simply drank tea. Then Evelyn closed her eyes and said that she was very curious to talk to Theodore. The girl opened her eyes and looked very carefully at the prince, and then the man recognized in those eyes the one he had seen in his childhood, and the one who was dear to him. Theodore opened his mouth in surprise when he realized who his new acquaintance was, and Miss Stewart said she was simply curious to see the man for whom her own father had abandoned her. The prince stood up from the table and realized that the girl was indeed his teacher's daughter. Evelyn simply smiled sweetly at him and looked at the man more and more closely. Theodore's teacher was a selfless man, and being a close friend of his father, he looked after the boy. He was constantly by the prince's side and raised him as his own son. And so, one fateful day, the teacher, without a moment's hesitation, gave his life saving little Theodore. The man looked at Mrs. Stewart and realized that she was the daughter of his savior. The girl smiled sweetly at him, realizing that the prince had guessed everything. Evelyn said she never imagined that she would end up in his bedroom at their first meeting. Then the girl smirked and added that he was a very frivolous man. Theodore, clearly not expecting such a statement from the girl, jumped up from the table and began to explain that he was completely different. And Mrs. Stewart laughed, saying that she was just fooling around, and was glad to see the prince in good health. Evelyn said she would feel uneasy if she found the man for whom her father had given his life in misfortune. The man was silent. He was not happy, but the most important thing was that he was healthy. The girl drank tea and continued to watch Theodore's behavior very closely. Here, the prince asked Mrs. Stewart to tell her how she had lived and where she had lived until now. Evelyn smirked and asked why the man was so interested in knowing this. Theodore looked away and informed the girl that the teacher had mentioned her from time to time. Then the prince added that her father did not say anything specific about Evelyn, but mentioned that he had a child. Little Theodore was very interested and asked the teacher questions, but he didn't even name the child's gender, but only said that he was terribly proud of how much they looked alike. The prince continued to confess, and Mrs. Stewart, silently and with a smile, listened to his story. The man seemed to be trying to wash away the feeling of guilt that had tormented him all these long years. And so he added that he had been looking for Evelyn all this time, as he had many reasons. Theodore admitted that he had no one to whom he could entrust revenge on the emperor, and that all this time he needed an ally to whom he could open up without any problems. The girl silently looked at the prince and he noted to himself that she really did look a lot like her father. After the man's confession, Ms. Stewart said she was glad he had let go of his burden and told her everything. Evelyn said she would be annoyed if Theodore didn't know of her existence. However, it is not surprising that the prince could not find her, because he did not know who to look for, a man or a woman. Moreover, the girl grew up in surprisingly favorable conditions, and she was never raised as a teacher's daughter. Theodore was very surprised by what he heard, and asked what Mrs. Stewart meant. Evelyn said that her father's opponents were very vile people, so she was handed over to the care of the knights. All this happened immediately after the girl was born, and she was sent to the west, where the knights' village was located. The prince was seized with horror, because he knew very well who owned the lands in that area. Mrs. Stewart smirked when she saw the man's expression, and she confirmed Theodore's thoughts, that she was sent to the territory that belonged to the Everin family. But to their surprise, it turned out to be even safer, and in the end, no one found out about Evelyn's existence. The girl said that her father was obsessed with lineage, so he could not give a nobleman's daughter into the hands of commoners. When her father was free, he visited Evelyn with gifts, and she was always happy about these moments. But then, before she even grew up, the girl was adopted by the family of Baron Stewart, who were in debt to the teacher. Evelyn added that she had lived without any worries, so Theodore did not have to worry about her. The girl said that the survivors are called winners, so she believes that she and the prince won. After all these stories, they sat at the table for a long time, continuing their conversation, and the seeds of friendship blossomed between them. As they parted at dawn, the man told Mrs. Stewart that he owed a great debt to the teacher, adding that he wants to repay this debt to Evelyn and take care of her future. The girl did not expect this, and looking at Theodore, she asked him to swear on his name. The prince looked very attentively at Mrs. Stewart and gave her his oath. Anastasia woke up early in the morning and decided to open the curtains by her window to let some light into the room. Here our heroine saw her fiancé in the company of his new acquaintance. Realizing that the couple had spent all this time together, the girl grinned very sarcastically. The next day, the servants in the residence were whispering that there had been some girl in their master's bedroom the previous day. One of the girls was very surprised by this and hoped that it was not Anastasia. But her colleague said that it was not about our heroine, but about the steward's daughter, who left the residence only early in the morning. The maids who heard this gasped, because it seemed to them that the girl was from a decent family and would not sleep with a man before marriage. But the servants understood that the couple spent the whole night together, and all this happened behind the bride's back. The maids understood that after these events, the engagement with Anastasia would most likely be broken off, and she would be thrown out. Meanwhile, our heroine was sitting in her room with Ellie and tidying herself up. She asked the maid if she had seen the woman who had entered Mr. Theodore's bedroom yesterday. And then Anastasia added that she found Mrs. Stewart very beautiful. Without thinking twice, Ellie replied that she considered our heroine much more beautiful than that woman. Anastasia turned to the maid and said that she did not agree with her, but would not ask about it anymore. Ellie was very glad to hear this, because she would have answered in any case that her mistress was better than all other women. But our heroine noted to herself that Evelyn's beauty seemed to fill the entire space. Anastasia smiled and said that the prince most likely intended to continue communicating with Mrs. Stewart. Then she asked Ellie if she found it funny that an engaged man would take a mistress. But then our heroine became sad and added that, although she herself was no better, after all, the girl was in love with Sergei and spent all her free time with him. Anastasia understood that no matter which of them took a lover, only she would be blamed. But in fact, for our heroine this had absolutely no meaning. The girl's face became very serious, because she understood what she would have to do. Anastasia imagined the picture of Mrs. Stewart's death, and how Theodore would grieve over her. Meanwhile, time passed. Our heroine, together with the prince, attended balls, at which the man spent all his time with Evelyn. Theodore never confessed his love to the girl, but Anastasia had no doubts about their romantic connection. After all, the prince, without reason, presented Mrs. Stewart with a huge number of gifts. I constantly went with her to the theater and the opera to see completely different productions. Well, and most importantly, Theodore left Anastasia alone at every ball and always accompanied Evelyn. The man was very nice to the girl and was constantly smiling around her. And looking at his happy face, our heroine was convinced of his love for Mrs. Stewart. But Evelyn, when she was next to Theodore, was almost always serious. After all, she understood that she wanted to achieve everything on her own, and not with the help of the prince's connections. Nevertheless, the girl accepted the man's gifts and spent time with him. One evening, Mrs. Stewart decided that it was time to break off this connection with Mr. Theodore. Looking at Anastasia, Evelyn understood that the prince was engaged to her, and she was his bride. Our heroine stood silently and watched the couple's dance very carefully. Theodore noticed that Mrs. Stewart was looking away and asked what she saw there. Evelyn replied that she was watching his fiancée, and it seemed to her that the girl was in love with him. The prince clearly did not expect such words from Mrs. Stewart and stopped dancing. The man asked Evelyn very indignantly and seriously why she thought so. But the girl laughed and said that she did not want to embarrass Theodore with her statement. The prince closed his eyes and calmly exhaled, saying that Mrs. Stewart's observation was incorrect. But Evelyn did not back down and said that, in her opinion, Anastasia's eyes were full of love and jealousy for her fiancé. Our heroine's gaze was truly full of anger and even looked a little frightening. Theodore decided to remain silent, and Mrs. Stewart suggested that he not talk about Anastasia anymore. Evelyn decided to ask the prince how he intended to arrange her future. The man did not expect this question, but he gathered his courage and said that if she wanted, he could make her his wife. After these words, the girl looked at Theodore very attentively and seriously. Then Mrs. Stewart began to move away from the prince, saying that she thought he would say that. Evelyn finished the dance, saying that she was not going to take the Redford name. The girl said that until now, she had accepted Theodore's kindness only because she wanted to ease his feelings of guilt. Mrs. Stewart walked very quickly to the other end of the room, and the prince followed her. Evelyn said she felt a kinship with the man, so she wanted to somehow ease his suffering by allowing him to repay his debt. But the girl hates the name Redford no less than the Everdeens, because if it weren't for them, her life would have turned out differently. Theodore looked away silently, not knowing what to answer Mrs. Stewart. Evelyn looked at him and knew she needed to somehow diffuse the situation. The girl saw Anastasia watching them and knew that he had deliberately started communicating with her in order to make the bride jealous. Mrs. Stewart looked playfully at Theodore, saying that she had one important rule. Evelyn said that, in her opinion, marriage should be concluded only based on mutual love and nothing else. The girl added that for her, marriage without love is unacceptable, and she hopes that the prince shares the same views. The man clearly did not expect to hear all this, and therefore looked at Mrs. Stewart in great surprise. After that, he grinned and said that Evelyn never ceases to amaze him. The girl laughed and replied that Theodore was simply being prejudiced against her. Mrs. Stewart looked away from the prince and saw Anastasia again. Our heroine noticed Evelyn's gaze on her and froze in surprise. But realizing that the girl was engrossed in conversation with her fiancé, Anastasia smiled. Our heroine had no intention of retreating, so she remained standing behind the column, watching the couple. Mrs. Stewart turned to Theodore and asked him to ignore her for several balls in a row, no matter what happened. The prince did not understand why this was happening, and therefore looked at Evelyn in great surprise. The girl's eyes were serious, and she said that she just needed to make sure of something. Mrs. Stewart remembered the mad face of Anastasia, who was watching them and was a little horrified. There was another ball. Theodore, as promised, ignored Evelyn, but our heroine followed her closely. At one point, Anastasia stepped on the hem of Ms. Stewart's dress. Hearing the sound of tearing fabric, Evelyn stopped and froze. Our heroine, however, was very happy that she had managed to do some mischief. Then Anastasia, in a very sweet voice, said that she had accidentally stepped on the hem of the girl's dress. Our heroine apologized to Mrs. Stewart and looked at her very sarcastically. Evelyn, very slowly, and as if a little hesitantly, turned to the girl, and smiling, she asked if Mrs. Everdene's apology was truly sincere. Anastasia clearly did not expect such a question from the girl, and did not know what to answer her. Evelyn looked at our heroine with interest, not understanding why she was doing all this. After all, lately, Anastasia's behavior has been really very strange. Our heroine deliberately bumped shoulders with the girl and mocked her. Mrs. Stewart had been silently enduring Anastasia's disgusting behavior all these days, realizing that our heroine thereby wants to provoke Theodore to some action. But the prince, who had promised Evelyn not to interfere, simply ignored all of this. The girl didn't understand why Anastasia and Theodore were communicating if they hated each other so much. Mrs. Stewart, looking at our heroine, said that she did not notice a hint of remorse on her face. Realizing that she was not going to tolerate this kind of treatment, Evelyn moved closer to the girl. She extended her hand to Anastasia and said that she absolutely could not lie. And having flicked our heroine on the nose, The girl said that in a lie it is not impudence that is important, but sincerity. After these words, Mrs. Stewart left the room, shouting at the end that it is precisely sincere people who are excellent liars. At the next ball, Anastasia did not change her tactics and continued to follow Evelyn closely. The girl realized that, despite what she had been told, it had not been a lesson to Mrs. Everdeen. Evelyn was a knight's daughter, and for a woman she was quite tall and strong in build. Even if Mrs. Stewart had been the daughter of a commoner, Anastasia, with her hungry childhood, would have been far behind her. Our heroine pushed the girl again, and each blow caused her severe pain. Evelyn decided that Anastasia was trying to pass herself off as a villain with all her actions. Meanwhile, our heroine pretended that she accidentally bumped into the girl and apologized to her every time. Ms. Stewart said that Anastasia seemed to have vision problems or was deliberately ignoring her. Our heroine clearly did not expect that Evelyn would answer her this time and looked at her in surprise. And the girl added that one way or another, the reason for everything was Anastasia's carelessness. Our heroine froze, not knowing what to answer, and Mrs. Stewart asked her to be more careful next time. Anastasia remained silent and bowed very slowly to Evelyn. Mrs. Stewart turned away from our heroine, and the girls, without saying a word, dispersed to different sides of the hall. Evelyn was just going to put Anastasia in her place a little and ask her about the reasons for such behavior. But this time, the girl was unable to do this because our heroine did not make contact with her. Gradually, Mrs. Stewart began to feel out of place. It seems that Anastasia has also decided to resort to a useless battle of attrition against her opponent. Evelyn didn't immediately understand this and constantly made comments to our heroine. But after that, every time the girl heard ridicule from behind her back, which greatly exhausted her. Every day, it seemed to Evelyn that she was being forced more and more into the drama that was playing out between Anastasia and Theodore. At the next ball, the prince took Mrs. Stewart out onto the terrace and apologized to her for the inconvenience caused. The girl said that the man had nothing to apologize for, but she would like him to leave her alone now. Theodore respected Mrs. Stewart's wishes, and after looking at her, he slowly left the terrace. Evelyn sat down on the railing and thought to herself that the prince's desperate attempts to help her were no less exhausting. Then the balcony door opened again, and the girl slowly looked up. Anastasia came onto the terrace and silently looked at Mrs. Stewart. Evelyn immediately said that she did not have the strength to argue with our heroine, and she did not know why she was trying to provoke Theodore. But before she could finish speaking, the girl felt something wet on her face and body. Anastasia laughed, asking for forgiveness for spilling a glass of wine on Mrs. Stewart. Evelyn was silent and understood that everything our heroine was doing was part of some stupid plan. Drops of red liquid slowly dripped onto the floor, and the girl realized that she was very tired of all this. Mrs. Stewart thought to herself that if Anastasia wanted it that way, then she would play by her rules. And snatching the glass from our heroine's hands, Evelyn threw it aside. The girl stood up very quickly and came very close to Anastasia. She hugged our heroine and asked what she wanted from her. The girl remained silent, and Mrs. Stewart said that someday she would still demand an explanation from her. She looked into Anastasia's eyes and saw only terrible despair and madness there. Frightened for a moment by all this, Evelyn stepped aside and fell silent. But then, unable to bear it any longer, she asked our heroine why she hated her so much. Anastasia seemed to be expecting this question, so she laughed very loudly and cheerfully. Mrs. Stewart, out of anger and helplessness, swung at our heroine, but she only smiled. Evelyn said that she had been trying to understand Anastasia's actions all this time, but she was very tired of it all. Hearing screams and very strange sounds from the terrace, Theodore ran in that direction. He pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers who were watching the proceedings and was very afraid for Mrs. Stewart. Running out onto the terrace, the prince was very shocked by what he saw there. Evelyn grabbed Anastasia's hair with all her anger, and it was clear from her movements that she had no intention of retreating. The man froze in horror for a moment, as he did not immediately understand what was happening. But literally, a few seconds later, Theodore very loudly ordered Anastasia to stop the fight. The prince approached Mrs. Stewart and with a sharp movement of his hand pushed our heroine away from her. The girl stumbled and, unable to stay on her feet, fell to the floor from the force of the impact. The man turned to Evelyn and asked with concern in his voice if she was okay. Anastasia, sitting on the floor, asked in a trembling voice why the prince had pushed her. The man, who had been acting on emotion until then, froze, realizing what he had done. Theodore looked at our heroine in horror and replayed his last actions in his head. The girl was sitting on the floor, and from her expression, it was clear that she did not expect this from her fiancé. The prince did not answer, because he was very afraid for Mrs. Stewart and was protecting her. The man looked at the daughter of the teacher, to whom he was infinitely grateful, and said that he didn't care about Anastasia. Our heroine was shocked by what she heard and continued to sit on the floor. And Theodore said that, until now, he had allowed the woman to do whatever she wanted only because he did not care about her. Evelyn clearly did not expect to hear such words from the prince about his bride. And he continued to say that Anastasia was of absolutely no value to him. Mrs. Stewart decided to stop Theodore, because no matter how strong his hatred was, it could not be said in public. But the prince did not listen to Evelyn, and told our heroine that the mere thought of him sharing his life with her made him sick. The crowd was shocked by what they heard, but the man did not shut up and said that he was simply disgusted by the girl's vulgarity. Anastasia continued to sit on the floor, look at her fiancé, and remain silent. Theodore did not calm down and said that it would be better if our heroine lay in the grave with her parents. Mrs. Stewart froze in horror and turned to the man and asked him to stop. Evelyn looked at Theodore and asked what he was trying to achieve by behaving like this. The prince turned to the girl and, asking her forgiveness, asked if she was wounded. Mrs. Stewart was clearly angry and said she was perfectly fine, but she was worried about Anastasia. The man said that Evelyn was much more dear to him than our heroine, and he would not forgive himself if she got hurt. The girl looked at Theodore and didn't know what to answer to his statements about Anastasia. Mrs. Stewart treated Theodore well, because for this man, her father sacrificed his life. Evelyn was kind to him because she believed that he would always be true to the best human qualities. But the girl never thought that he would turn out to be someone who was completely unworthy of salvation. Mrs. Stewart looked away and sadly looked at Anastasia. Our heroine continued to sit on the floor and look down, and Evelyn understood that it was too late to stand up for her now. Mrs. Stewart walked very slowly and hesitantly straight towards the exit from the terrace. They went out together with Theodore, and Anastasia remained sitting on the floor. People were shocked by what happened on the terrace, but everyone stood silently. Everyone looked at each other and did not know why Theodore treated his bride so terribly. Anastasia continued to sit on the floor and heard how people began to whisper and feel sorry for her. Our heroine was silent, going over in her head everything that had just happened, and realizing that her plan had worked. The girl's lips spread into a sly smile. Later, Anastasia went home alone, as Theodore continued to spend time with Mrs. Stewart. Our heroine was riding in a carriage and thought that she would definitely win the battle with Evelyn. The girl looked at her reflection and thought that Ellie would most likely make a fuss again when she saw her abrasions. Anastasia had no doubt that the other servants would open champagne on this occasion. When they arrived, our heroine very slowly got out of the carriage and headed into the house. The abrasion on her face hurt a lot, and the girl wanted to treat it quickly. Anastasia very quickly climbed the stairs to the second floor and headed to her room. But then one of the maids came out from around the corner towards our heroine and was frightened when she saw severe scratches. The servant asked with concern in her voice what was wrong with her mistress's face. Anastasia realized that the maid was afraid for her and did not expect such a reaction. When Ellie saw our heroine, she almost lost consciousness from horror. Then tears began to flow from the maid's eyes, because Anastasia looked completely different before leaving. Our heroine asked Ellie not to scream, saying that she was very tired and wanted to go to bed. The maid lowered her eyes to the floor and asked who did this to the girl. Anastasia replied that it didn't concern her, and that she felt fine even with that face, although she understood that Ellie was worried. The maid looked very closely at our heroine's face and said that she had a split lip. The girl timidly replied that it was all a trifle, and that her lip would soon heal. Ellie looked at Anastasia and said that she didn't understand her at all. Our heroine replied that this was not surprising, because she herself did not understand herself. The girl lowered her eyes to the floor and told Ellie to just look and think only about what she saw in front of her. Anastasia said that she was completely fine, even though it didn't look that way. Our heroine reported that for the first time at the ball, people began to sympathize with her. The girl smiled, realizing that she needed to somehow take advantage of this moment for her own purposes. Ellie said that Anastasia had some problems with her gait, and she needed to see a doctor. The maid quickly lifted our heroine's dress up to examine it, and she was horrified when she saw a huge abrasion on her leg, because Ellie did not understand how the girl got home. Anastasia pulled her dress out of the maid's hands and reported that Mr. Theodore had pushed her. Ellie was shocked by what she heard, and our heroine said that it was not surprising, because the prince hated her. The maid covered her mouth with her hand in horror, realizing that the man's act was very cruel. Anastasia replied that she had already gotten used to this attitude and did not see anything wrong with it. Our heroine remembered the face of Mrs. Stewart, who was clearly surprised by Theodore's behavior. The girl realized that Evelyn was trying to calm the prince down, because he had clearly overdone it. But why she behaved like that was unclear. Meanwhile, Theodore and Mrs. Stewart, who had been at the ball all this time, decided to go home. Evelyn walked ahead, holding the prince's hand very tightly, leading him behind her. The man thought about the incident on the terrace and realized that he needed to put an end to the quarrels with Anastasia. He tried to remember all the details of this evening, but he completely forgot what expression was on our heroine's face. Theodore could not remember the moment when the girl left the terrace, and he was afraid that she might still be there. But then the prince began to drive these thoughts away from himself, because now he shouldn't worry about Anastasia's condition. He followed Mrs. Stewart, and in his thoughts, he did not notice how they entered some room. The man did not understand what was happening, because he was completely sure that they were going to go home now. Evelyn closed the door tightly behind them, and Theodore looked at her and asked why they had come here. Mrs. Stewart's expression changed to anger, and she asked the prince what he was trying to achieve by his behavior. The man stood in a stupor, realizing that Evelyn was now asking him about the incident on the terrace. Theodore clenched his fists and thought to himself that he would not tell the girl what a mess our heroine had made in his life. The prince pretended not to understand what Mrs. Stewart was talking about and asked her what she meant. Evelyn didn't expect such a question from a man, and therefore, for a moment, she was at a loss, not knowing what to tell him. But having pulled herself together, she almost shouted angrily that Theodore himself understood perfectly well what she meant. It was clear from the prince's eyes that he regretted what he had done and could in no way justify his actions. The girl, looking closely at the man, said that her father clearly had not taught him this. After all, he must understand that treating a girl so rudely is not normal. After these words, Theodore looked at his hand and realized that he had not acted like a man. Images of the last few hours flashed before his eyes again, and he remembered how he pushed Anastasia away with his hand. The prince tried to calm his tremors, and therefore clenched his ill-fated hand into a fist. Mrs. Stewart asked the man to say something already, because she did not want to be disappointed in him. Theodore let out a very long sigh, and said that no one had taught him such terrible behavior. Evelyn asked if that was the case. Then why did he behave so terribly? Because it looked like he had lost his mind. The prince answered in a very calm tone that perhaps the girl would not believe him, but he was in his right mind. Mrs. Stewart clearly did not expect such an answer from the man, and fell silent for a while, but then she said that he had nevertheless insulted Mrs. Everdene's parents. And this is completely wrong, and this behavior is clearly unbecoming of a gentleman. Not to mention that the prince had no need to push Anastasia. The man stood silently, listening to the claims against him, and realized his guilt. Evelyn continued to say that, of course, being doused with wine, she looked terrible, but this only elevated her above Anastasia. Then the girl fixed her hair and added that she would have been able to resolve this situation on her own, and Theodore only made everything worse with his unnecessary intervention. The prince, who had been silent all this time, opened his mouth and could only say that he had not done all this on purpose, and Mrs. Stewart told him that even if that was true, he was still wrong in this situation. The man lowered his head and said that he couldn't treat our heroine well because she was Everdene. Evelyn didn't expect such a reaction from Theodore, because he was completely dejected, and she realized that the problem was not in the relationship between the prince and Anastasia, but in her last name. The girl looked at the man and understood that he was actually sincerely ashamed. Mrs. Stewart noted to herself that Theodore was not as harmless as she thought, and she said that first of all, Anastasia is a person, and only then Everdene, and her uncle did everything to get rid of her. The girl added that she was very disappointed in the prince, which surprised him. The man looked very carefully at Mrs. Stewart and made sure that there was not a scratch on her face, just as she said. Theodore realized that he had rushed to defend Evelyn in vain, because she could very well stand up for herself. And then, before the prince's eyes, images of Anastasia's wounded face began to appear vividly. The man was horrified to realize that he had inadvertently caused our heroine great pain. Theodore closed his eyes, not understanding how it all happened and why he behaved so strangely. The prince clenched his fists out of guilt and the understanding that he could no longer fix anything. Mrs. Stewart, who had been standing silently and watching the man, suddenly said abruptly that she was very tired. She asked Theodore for forgiveness, and turned around and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. After the ball ended, the prince had no choice but to also go to his residence. Arriving home, the man could not go inside, as he was afraid of running into Anastasia. He was afraid of the face our heroine would greet him with, but he understood that it might be her fake smile. Or it will be something completely different, very unusual for him. The prince was afraid that he would find our heroine in tears and in a dejected state, as after Sergei's death. The man walked around the garden, biding his time and hoping that our heroine would go to bed. Theodore didn't understand what he was feeling right now, and was completely confused about himself. Suddenly, the man realized that his feet had led him straight to the girl's windows. He very slowly and hesitantly raised his eyes up to see if the light in the bedroom was off. It turned out that Anastasia was not yet asleep, and at that very moment, she was on the balcony. Theodore looked at her and realized that now that the Everdeens were gone, the girl truly ceased to belong to their family. Our heroine noticed the prince and looked at him, and he realized that he still felt hatred towards her. Here the girl smiled and asked if Theodore had a good time at the ball without her. Anastasia, with that smile on her face and the abrasion on her cheek, looked very strange. The prince looked at her and asked why she was asking him about all this. Our heroine laughed and replied that it was all because she was constantly thinking about her fiancé. The man clearly did not expect to hear this from the girl, and for a while he was speechless. It seemed obvious to him that her words were a lie, but at the same time, for some reason, he was pleased to hear it. Anastasia closed her eyes and said that today at the ball, she felt a little sad. Theodore looked at our heroine, not understanding why she was behaving so strangely, and the girl continued, saying that it seemed like she was still the prince's fiancé, but he stood up for another wife in front of the public. Then she looked at the sky, and seeing the moon, added that, being engaged, he still allows himself to come back so late. Anastasia asked if he really liked Mrs. Stewart that much. Theodore, still in shock, remained silent, not knowing what to answer to her words. Then the prince turned around very slowly, and going over the entire day in his head, went home. Our heroine, clearly accustomed to the fact that her fiancé almost never answered her, did not call out to him. She simply silently looked after him, not understanding whether she had managed to touch him or not. The man walked through the garden and began to think about Mrs. Stewart's words. Theodore couldn't understand one thing. Since when did he start to hate Anastasia so much? The prince turned around, looked again at the silhouette of the girl visible in the distance, and began to remember. Theodore's life, from his childhood onwards and after his father's death, was unthinkable without hatred. Images of his first meeting with our heroine suddenly began to flash before the prince's eyes. The man remembered how he first saw Anastasia in his garden, and then she seemed like just a child to him. He realized that as soon as he heard her last name, he simply lost his mind, and he began to hate the young, innocent girl, completely without reason. Memories of all his terrible conversations with our heroine began to float before Theodore's eyes. She was always nice to him, but the prince didn't want to hear her. The man constantly tried to make the girl hysterical by reminding her of the death of her parents. Theodore was haunted by a terrible feeling of guilt for the actions he had committed, and that same night, Anastasia appeared to him in a dream, in Sergei's arms, and she looked very happy. The smile on our heroine's face was real this time, not fake like it had been lately. Quite suddenly, the girl turned around and looked towards the prince, and Sergei's figure miraculously seemed to dissolve into thin air. Anastasia's outfit changed, and she appeared before Theodore in all black. The smile disappeared from our heroine's lips, and looking at the prince, she said that it was all his fault. A few days later, another dinner party took place, to which our heroes also came. Anastasia was sad that she had wasted several days due to an ankle injury. Our heroine had not attended balls all this time, and she was interested to find out how public opinion had changed towards her. The girl began to look at the guests at the ball, hoping that her time of absence had not been in vain. The guests whispered behind Anastasia's back, but this time everything was somehow different. People looked at our heroine without a drop of disdain or condemnation. The girl was very surprised, because she read pity and sympathy in their looks. Anastasia covered her mouth with her hand, not believing that people's attitude towards her had changed so dramatically. Our heroine was simply sickened by the sympathy of all these strangers. After all, she understood that they all still wouldn't dare to approach her and talk. Then a girl appeared behind Anastasia and looked at her very closely. Our heroine looked back at her, not understanding what she wanted from her. The stranger looked surprisingly very serious and did not take her eyes off Anastasia. After this, The girl grabbed the hem of her dress very tightly and squeezed it. Our heroine noted to herself that despite the stranger's expression, she did not feel any hostility from her. The girl came closer to Anastasia, and she realized that this was the Viscount's daughter, named Brianna, who had made her debut this year. She asked very timidly how Mrs. Everdeen was feeling after what had happened. Our heroine realized that the girl was young, and most likely that is why she decided to approach her. Anastasia took a few steps towards Brianna and thought that she needed supporters now. Our heroine covered her healed cheek with her hand and thanked the girl for her care. Then, Anastasia smiled very sweetly and added that she was completely fine. The Viscount's daughter looked at our heroine with pity and sadness. Then, behind the girl's back, a silhouette that was already familiar to Anastasia appeared. It was Mrs. Stewart. She turned to Brianna, asking her to step aside, as she wanted to talk to our heroine alone. The girl looked at Evelyn in great surprise, not knowing what to answer. Mrs. Stewart smiled very sweetly at the Viscount's daughter and introduced herself. Then she asked to be left with Mrs. Everdeen for a minute, so that she could talk to her. After these words, there was silence. The girl was in no hurry to answer, and she and Anastasia only looked at Evelyn in surprise. But then the Viscount's daughter's face changed, and she said that after Mrs. Stewart's actions, she would not leave our heroine alone with her. Evelyn smiled and replied that there was nothing incredible about a quarrel that ended in reconciliation. Then she leaned towards the girl and added that before this incident, no one had noticed Anastasia, and this was real rudeness. Mrs. Stewart asked the Viscount's daughter her name, but then said that she was not really interested in knowing. The girl was very angry at Evelyn's impudence, but she couldn't say a word to her. The Viscount's daughter turned around and, clenching her fists, headed to the other end of the hall. Mrs. Stewart exhaled, saying that at last this tiresome lady had left her alone with Anastasia. Then Evelyn looked very closely at our heroine, demanding that she follow her, as they needed to talk. Anastasia's face changed, not knowing what awaited her next, but she was not going to refuse Miss Stewart. The girl took our heroine to the terrace, already familiar to both of them, and closed the door. Anastasia asked Mrs. Stewart what it was that she wanted to talk to her about, bringing her to this place. Evelyn turned and looked at our heroine and asked how her cheek and ankle were. Anastasia remained silent, and Mrs. Stewart decided to come closer to her. Evelyn looked at our heroine, trying to understand what was going on in her head. And unable to bear the tension, the girl asked to explain what Anastasia was actually trying to achieve. Mrs. Stewart realized that our heroine was using her for some purpose. Therefore, Evelyn believed that she had the right to know what motivated the girl. Anastasia didn't know what to answer, and so she just stood there and remained silent. Our heroine noted to herself that Mrs. Stewart spoke as if she understood her, although they were not close. Anastasia had never met people like this before, so she didn't know what to answer. Evelyn, unable to stand the silence, said that she had heard the unfortunate life story of our heroine. Anastasia was very surprised by what she heard, so she immediately raised her head and looked at the girl. Mrs. Stewart went on to say that our heroine was only pretending to be in love with Theodore and that she was jealous of him. Anastasia very unemotionally and dryly answered Evelyn that this was absolutely not true. The girl was glad that our heroine spoke to her and said that she was lying, because she clearly just hated him. Anastasia smirked and replied that Ms. Stewart just wanted to think so. Evelyn exhaled and said that she had excellent intuition and could tell what a person was thinking by the expression on their face. The girl said that she found our heroine's relationship a little peculiar, and Mrs. Stewart believes that Anastasia's eyes immediately reveal her attitude towards Theodore. After that, Evelyn very quickly came closer to Mrs. Everdeen. The girl, with a sharp movement, grabbed our heroine by the hand and pulled her towards herself. Then Ms. Stewart said that when a person looks at the object of his love, his pupils become wider. But when you look at someone you dislike, your pupils become really tiny. Anastasia looked away, realizing that Evelyn had guessed everything. The girl asked our heroine to look her in the eyes, but she just turned her back to her. Mrs. Stewart grabbed Anastasia's hand again and said that her pulse was racing, which also indicated hostility. Our heroine smiled and said that all this was because Evelyn was next to her, and it would be strange for her to feel anything different when a girl talks about such things. Anastasia looked at Mrs. Stewart and said that she loved Mr. Theodore. Looking at Evelyn, she said that she felt hatred towards her fiancé's mistress. The girl watched our heroine and understood that she did not hate her, and that these were all empty words. Mrs. Everdeen looked at Mrs. Stewart very carefully, and her face showed no emotion. Then, with a sharp movement, Anastasia broke free from Evelyn's grip and stepped aside. Mrs. Stewart offered our heroine her friendship, saying that it hurt her to look at her. Then she added that Mrs. Everdeen needed someone she could rely on, and someone she didn't hate so much. Finally, Anastasia came face to face with the reality that she had continued to deny until now. Evelyn's eyes were very similar to the eyes of her lover Sergei. Who knows, maybe if she had met her earlier, she would have loved her more. But unfortunately, it was already too late, so our heroine understood that they would never be friends. Anastasia was very outraged by Ms. Stewart's words about her past. She absolutely did not like that Evelyn felt sorry for her because she had gotten rid of one of her enemies with her own hands. Mrs. Stewart's words were certainly filled with kindness, but alas, they did not find a response in the heart of our heroine. The girl grabbed Evelyn and started screaming that she hated her because she had everything. Anastasia screamed that Mrs. Stewart had beauty, a happy family, and a loved one. Evelyn had everything that our heroine lacked, and this made her very angry. Therefore, without thinking twice, Mrs. Everdeen pushed the girl off the balcony with a sharp movement. Anastasia looked down at the floor and knew that with all her heart, she wished for Mrs. Stewart's death. But then she realized that all this was just a figment of her imagination. Looking up, our heroine realized that she had not pushed Evelyn and that she was looking at her very carefully. Anastasia knew that if she killed the girl now and she was caught, it could hardly be called ideal revenge. Our heroine closed her eyes and said that she simply hated Mrs. Stewart. After this, Anastasia noted to herself that she needed to stop superimposing Evelyn's image onto Sergei's image. And don't forget that now she is a woman mad with love for Theodore. Our heroine looked at the girl and reminded her that Mr. Redford was her fiancé. He is wonderful, and there is no person who does not respect him. And in Anastasia's opinion, this is already enough to explain her love for him. And Evelyn tries in every way to come between them, and is confusing her fiancé. For this reason, our heroine asked Mrs. Stewart not to approach her in the future. Anastasia added very dryly that she did not want to have anything in common with her rival. Evelyn looked at the girl very carefully and laughed and said that this was all nonsense. Our heroine decided to end this conversation, so she very quickly headed towards the exit. With a sharp movement of her hand, she pushed Evelyn aside and informed her that they had nothing more to talk about. Leaving the terrace, Anastasia's lips spread into a sly and self-satisfied smile. But Mrs. Stewart decided that their conversation was not finished, and so she called out to our heroine. She told Anastasia to remember that one day she would be able to rely on her. Our heroine did not react to these words in any way, but only opened the terrace door and left it. But the girl noted to herself that Evelyn could not help her in any way, since she had always lived a carefree life. Walking through the hall, Anastasia thought that Ms. Stewart simply amazed her. Our heroine understood that she would never be able to become friends with Evelyn, and all because Mrs. Stewart was the youngest daughter of a very wealthy baron. The girl lived a carefree life all her life, and she will never understand what Anastasia went through. Our heroine understood that Evelyn knew nothing about her life at all, and therefore could not help her. Here Anastasia came across a crowd of girls and noticed a familiar face among them. It was Mrs. Brianna, and our heroine, smiling very sweetly, asked forgiveness for keeping her waiting. The girl smiled back and said that it was okay, since her friends were keeping her company. Anastasia took Mrs. Brianna by the hands and said that she was terribly worried about the way they parted. The girl said that she did not expect this from our heroine, and that it was all very kind of her. Anastasia smiled and thought to herself that Mrs. Brianna was very trusting. She understood that nowadays it was rare to meet a person who would bare his soul. After all, this entire hypocritical world lives according to the terrible and wild law of the jungle. Our heroine believed that it would not be difficult for her to use the girl for her own purposes. Here, Anastasia realized that Mrs. Brianna was eager to find out what she and Evelyn had talked about. But our heroine pretended not to understand why the girl was looking at her so attentively. Mrs. Bryan asked very timidly about the topic of Evelyn's conversation with Anastasia. Our heroine made a surprised face and decided for herself that if the girls wanted gossip, then she would give it to them. Anastasia, unexpectedly for everyone, began to cry, realizing that she needed to play out a drama and embellish everything. The girls did not expect such a reaction from our heroine and asked for forgiveness for interfering in something that was none of their business. But Anastasia confidently leaned towards the girls and began to whisper her embellished story. Since that ill-fated ball, rumors about our heroes have been spreading in society. The girl heard people whispering behind her back and sincerely feeling sorry for her. After all, everyone around believed that Theodore's infidelity was the cause of Anastasia's unbearable torment. People began to appear who spoke ill of Mrs. Stewart. There were also those people who expressed their dissatisfaction towards the prince, although there were few of them. And of course, those who continued to vilify Anastasia just because she was Everdeen still existed. Our heroine was amused by all this, and she no longer cared what people said about her. After all, society was divided, and now many believed that the girl was jealous of her fiancé. But despite all the rumors, the prince still did not move away from Evelyn even one step. Although Mrs. Stewart tried to keep her distance, so much so that Theodore decided to clarify why she had distanced herself from him. The girl was very surprised to hear this question, because she, as before, was always next to him. She just sometimes danced with others. Evelyn understood that the prince was worried about this, so she decided to cheer him up by telling him that she enjoyed his company. The man immediately beamed with happiness, because he was afraid that he had become disgusting to the girl. Mrs. Stewart knew that she was something of a last hope for him, but more and more often, this became a burden to her. Evelyn decided to find out if Theodore wanted her to feel embarrassed. The prince replied that, on the contrary, he wished her a simple and calm life. The girl said that she was not talking about that, because she just wanted the man to finally wake up from his sleep. Mrs. Stewart knew that Theodore didn't care about her, even though he thought otherwise. And it didn't matter whether Evelyn was happy with his behavior or not, whether she needed all this or not. He was just imposing his sense of duty on her, that's all. But the girl realized that for the sake of the future of Anastasia and the prince, she would not push him away. Mrs. Stewart understood that next to her, Theodore paid less attention to our heroine, and almost did not cause her pain. Even though it looked completely different from the outside, Evelyn knew that Anastasia did not love him. If only she could stop the prince's attacks on our heroine, she would stop paying him back in kind. In her thoughts, Mrs. Stewart did not notice how she and Theodore entered the hall and passed Anastasia. Here our heroine turned to her fiancé, asking him to dance with her. The prince did not expect to hear such a request, and therefore did not know what to answer. Anastasia stood silently, and was very embarrassed, waiting for Theodore to answer her. But when the pause dragged on for too long, our heroine realized that her fiancé was simply making fun of her, and he immediately confirmed this with his behavior, because without thinking twice, the prince silently turned away from the girl. Holding Evelyn's hand, he and she turned their backs to Anastasia, and they walked away from her. More than once, the man disgraced her in front of the public in this way, and people pitied our heroine. And Anastasia herself seemed to have changed, becoming more vulnerable and defenseless. At one of the balls, our heroine was called out by girls, who invited her to sit down with them. Anastasia noted to herself that it turns out that fitting into high society is quite easy. After all, she was taken in by the daughters of nobles who were suffering from the betrayal of their husbands and fiancés. The new acquaintances reasoned that the prince lacked compassion, and that Mrs. Stewart was also good, since she spent the night with an engaged man. Anastasia understood that even the girls who had sympathy for Evelyn had turned away from her. Our heroine knew that these ladies were against her getting closer to Mrs. Stewart, because that way they would be able to gossip more about them. Anastasia was thinking about how she could take advantage of this whole situation without losing their favor. But our heroine found the answer to this question much faster than she could even imagine. After all, one of the noble daughters told Anastasia that such terrible behavior of Mrs. Stewart could not be ignored. Our heroine remembered that a girl named Lois had already suffered enough from the fact that her fiancé fell in love with Evelyn. The new acquaintance looked at Mrs. Stewart and indignantly emphasized her bracelet, saying that it had clearly been given to her by the prince. Our heroine, seeing the expensive Rouen bracelet on the girl's hand, did not feel any self-interest or envy. Anastasia was ashamed of her own jewelry, for which she had been saving money for a long time. Our heroine, embarrassed, covered her bracelet with her hand and lowered her eyes to the floor. Mrs. Lois was outraged that Theodore chose Evelyn over Anastasia. Our heroine stood silently, still covering her bracelet with her hand out of cold. The girl, however, would not calm down and said that Anastasia simply had to do something and show Mrs. Stewart her place. Our heroine understood that it was Lois who hated Evelyn and wanted to take revenge on her through someone else's hands. Because unlike Anastasia, she is a very noble lady, but our heroine understood that she did not want to rush, because the time to kill Mrs. Stewart had not yet come. But nevertheless, Anastasia decided to ask with a grin what she should do. Lois answered without thinking twice. She had one idea, but for it, she needed to call Evelyn's coachman. The girls left the estate together and headed to the place where the guests' carriages were standing. Before reaching the place, the girls stopped because someone blocked their way. By a lucky chance, it was a young man who was Mrs. Stewart's coachman. Lois told Anastasia to talk to the man, and she would wait for her by the tree. Our heroine understood that the girl simply did not want to get her hands dirty. Anastasia hated these self-absorbed individuals with all her heart, and she was tired of pretending to be kind to them. The coachman looked at our heroine, not understanding what she wanted from him. Anastasia turned to the young man and said that she had one request for him. Then, without thinking twice, the girl took off the bracelet she already hated from her hand. Our heroine threw this bracelet towards the coachman, and he caught it very quickly. Anastasia asked the young man to scare his mistress, and for this she was ready to repay him with jewelry. The coachman looked at the girl in great surprise, frightened by her request. Our heroine said that if he sold the bracelet, he would be able to buy a small building. Or, with this money, he will be able to start his own business somewhere outside the capital. And this will clearly be enough for him for the rest of his life, if he doesn't waste it all. The girl said that the coachman only needed to damage one wheel on the cart, but only in such a way that it is clear that it was done intentionally. And if the young man's owner gets injured as a result of the breakage, that will be more than enough. Anastasia said that no one would suspect the young man since he himself would suffer. If everything goes well, the coachman will receive an additional reward, but if he refuses and blabs, she will kill him. Our heroine suggested that the young man think carefully about which case would give him the best chance of staying alive. The coachman was very frightened by the girl's words, but he was even more frightened by her crazy look. Anastasia looked at the young man very carefully and said that she was waiting for an answer from him. The coachman understood that he simply had no choice, so he agreed to fulfill the girl's request. After this, the young man squeezed the bracelet very tightly in his hand and ran to his carriage. Our heroine looked sadly at the floor and very slowly looked away. Then the girl remembered that her new friend should be waiting somewhere nearby. But turning around, Anastasia realized that there was no one else in the garden except her. Our heroine was angry at Lois because she simply abandoned her there and returned to the house. The girl will obviously, if anything happens, put all the blame on Anastasia and say that she herself had nothing to do with anything. Feeling terribly angry about all this, our heroine headed back into the house. Although right now, the last thing she wanted was to be in the company of these disgusting people. When Anastasia got to the room, she discovered that the ball had already ended. Our heroine saw her fiancé, who was heading towards the carriage with Mrs. Stewart. It seemed that he intended to accompany the girl all the way to the mansion, and if something happened to Evelyn, he would not leave her in trouble. Then a carriage pulled up to the girl, which was supposed to take her home. Anastasia looked up and realized that she had had a hand in ruining Evelyn's carriage today. Our heroine was interested in whether Mrs. Stewart felt disgust or hatred towards her, and whether she deserved punishment. Here, memories of their conversation on the terrace began to emerge before the girl's eyes. She remembered Evelyn's words, and that she offered Anastasia her friendship, assurance to our heroine that she will one day be able to rely on her in a difficult situation. But for Anastasia, it was simply unthinkable to believe the words spoken by Mrs. Stewart. Here, our heroine looked at her coachman and asked if everything was okay with the carriage. Hearing that everything was fine, the girl very slowly headed to her carriage. Anastasia was driving home, and she was very sad that Theodore chose Mrs. Stewart out of all the girls. After all, every time she was once again convinced that there was no evil intent in Evelyn's actions, she herself did not want to hurt her. Arriving at the Redford residence and going to her room, our heroine decided to share her experiences with Ellie. She told the maid that she had tried to kill an innocent person today. It's no secret that Mr. Theodore is extremely cold towards Anastasia, but nevertheless, he is affectionate with Mrs. Stewart. So every time our heroine sees them, bad thoughts come into her head. After all, Anastasia did not understand why her fiancé was cold towards her, and how much longer she had to live like this. Therefore, our heroine, without thinking twice, ordered that Mrs. Stewart's carriage be damaged. She wanted something bad to happen to Evelyn on the way back, and our heroine even gave her bracelet to the coachman as payment for him damaging the carriage. Anastasia realized that in the worst case, Mrs. Stewart could die. Ellie asked in surprise if the girl really hated Evelyn so much. Our heroine replied that she wanted to hate her, but for some reason her feelings were very confused right now. The maid asked what all this was about, Mr. Theodore, and Anastasia froze in silence for a moment. But then she replied that all this was partly because of him, but in general, Miss Stewart was simply disgusting to her. After all, when our heroine looks at Evelyn, She gets the feeling that she is starting to go crazy. Here, Anastasia turned very sharply to Ellie and asked what she thought about this situation. After all, our heroine was interested in what the person who claims to understand her would answer her. Not much time has passed since Ellie began serving Anastasia. Therefore, the girl did not know how to behave in such situations. After all, our heroine didn't need any sympathy or distant speeches about how everything would fall into place. For her whole appearance indicated that objections would cause her nothing but pain. So Ellie replied that it was unlikely that everything would go as her mistress wanted, since nowadays it was rare for someone to die in a carriage. The girl added that this whole situation will harm Anastasia herself much more than her enemy. But our heroine did not regret her attempt to kill Evelyn at all, because she herself wanted to condemn Theodore to suffering. So if it all ends in tragedy, she won't be too upset. But every day, she can't shake the feeling that she is irretrievably losing something. Here Anastasia got very angry at Ellie and shouted at her that she had started this conversation not in order to hear this. Our heroine broke free from the maid's hands and said that she was very tired of all this. Ellie leaned over her mistress and told her that this could not go on any longer. The girl took Anastasia by the hand and asked her to think about her health. Our heroine raised her eyes to Ellie and asked if she knew why she was doing all this. The maid thought that the reason for everything was the situation that had developed around Anastasia, and Ellie didn't understand why the girl didn't just run away, because the Duke, on whom she was dependent, was no longer there. It seemed to the maid that if she showed Anastasia another path, she would fall into even greater despair. So Ellie decided not to say another word and just stand next to the girl, holding her hand. Meanwhile, Theodore and Mrs. Stewart, who had been walking around the garden all this time, decided to also go home. The prince silently followed Evelyn, deciding to take her home in his carriage. Here the girl turned around abruptly and told the man that he could no longer see her off. Theodore clearly didn't expect to hear that, so he looked at Mrs. Stewart in great surprise. But Evelyn said he did it thinking she was in danger, which she wasn't. It was on this day that the girl made a clear decision that she would begin to push the prince away. Mrs. Stewart's resemblance to her father was undeniable, especially in her tendency to do the right thing. Theodore was fully aware of this and was afraid that one day Evelyn would reject him. He looked at the girl and said that of course he was seeing her off for protection. Mrs. Stewart let out a resigned sigh and replied that she was not the emperor's target and that Duke Everdeen had also passed away. So it seems to Evelyn that Theodore is not worried about her safety at all. The girl expressed her suspicion that the prince was trying his best to love her. After all, she remembered very well how he had told her that he wanted to repay the debt to her father, but that was not the way to repay a debt. According to Ms. Stewart, he did everything only with the aim of angering and hurting Anastasia. Theodore shouted to the girl that it was nothing of the sort, and that he was not thinking at all about Mrs. Everdeen. Evelyn headed towards the carriage and said that she did not intend to pretend to understand the prince's emotional experiences. The man approached the girl very quickly and tried to stop her. Theodore was so reluctant to let go of Mrs. Stewart that he accidentally stepped on her dress. But Evelyn, with a sharp movement, pulled the hem from under the prince's feet and did not even turn around. She walked towards the carriage and said that she had made a mistake in deciding to get to know him better, and that it would have been better if she had looked at the man from the outside. Miss Stewart added that she did not understand why her father gave his life for him. After all, the closer she gets to Theodore, the more disappointed she becomes in him. The prince stood silently, not expecting to hear such a thing from the girl, and did not know what to answer her to all this. Evelyn got into the carriage and looked at the man very carefully and seriously. The girl told Theodore to live his own life and leave Mrs. Everdeen alone. The prince did not want to let Evelyn go home alone, but he had no choice but to simply stand there. The expression on Mrs. Stewart's face was exactly like his teacher's when he was instructing him, and the sight of this painfully familiar face was reflected in a squeezing pain in his chest. Here the girl asked whether Theodore had ever felt sorry for Anastasia during all this time. The prince did not expect such a question, so he fell into a stupor for a while and thought about the answer. For the man, our heroine was the shackles that the emperor put on him. Anastasia behaved unbearably, and he had enough of her antics, especially in her behavior with the servants. And she was also a person whose eyes were an exact copy of the eyes of Duke Everdeen, who was just waiting for the moment to humiliate Theodore. The prince went through all these thoughts in his head, and in his opinion, our heroine was not worthy of compassion. Miss Stewart, not having received an answer from the man, said that she was very tired and went home. Evelyn added that she hoped that Theodore would one day be able to find peace, and the girl's carriage headed towards the house. The prince froze for a moment, slowly realizing what had just happened. He stood all alone, but he had the impression that Anastasia was right behind him. For a moment, Theodore even thought he heard the girl's voice and laughter. The prince understood that his head was a complete mess, and it was time for him to return home. The night passed quietly. The next day came, and Theodore received a letter with terrible news. Without thinking twice, he jumped out of bed and very quickly headed to his office. The prince was very angry, but at the same time focused, because he needed to find out all the details first. The advisor was already standing in the office, and Theodore immediately asked him what it meant that an accident had happened to Mrs. Stewart. Evan bowed and replied that everything had ended well, and that Evelyn's life was not in danger. But because of what happened, and because of the shock, the girl decided not to appear at balls for some time. The advisor said that he was embarrassed to tell the prince about this, but Baron Stewart passed on something to him. Evan said there was something very suspicious about the whole incident. After hearing this, Theodore, without thinking twice, headed towards Anastasia's room. He looked very angry, and opening the door, he began to shout at our heroine. The prince looked at the girl and said that he knew that she had done something to Mrs. Stewart's carriage. Anastasia silently raised her eyes and looked at her fiancé completely without emotion.